do a thumbs up when you guys are registering. I don't know, where's my guy?
Just wanted you to know that. Social height.
Or they're so desensitized that they really not just because nobody else is very smart.
And here's what we're going to do.
Do you want to erase?
Johnson wants to do it. And at that point, just maybe sit down. Stare at us and wait a second.
So just go like this.
Flip this off for something.
Check.
So let me. Are we all set to go? Set. Okay. We're all set.
Okay then. Hello everyone, I'm Mark Anderson. I'll be the moderator to this debate. I'd like to introduce Professor Caven and Mr. Miller here. They will be going over whether Jesus' resurrection is a fact or a myth, and I will let them introduce themselves. Starting with Professor Caven.
Well, first we're going to do 5 minutes on base theory.
Oh, 5 minutes here. Okay, well.
We're going to force you to listen. So, you can start.
Okay.
I'm going to raise this, and Susan will pull me.
Okay. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for coming out and for listening to me and Greg talk about this issue. I assume that most of you will be fairly interested in it. I did notice that this thing about Cyprus Sex Day was on the board, so if you're coming for that, that's the wrong thing, and you should leave now. But we're going to be talking about something much more exciting than sex, which is Bayes' theorem.
Much more.
I can assure you. And applying it to Jesus' resurrection. So we thought we'd at the start talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem and how to understand it to begin with. So what Bayes' theorem is basically a mathematical formula which helps us to calculate probabilities. So in the case of the resurrection, for example, we want to know what is the probability that Jesus' resurrection happened given the evidence we have. And that's what this means. It means the probability of the resurrection R given the evidence E. And this is just the probability of the resurrection didn't happen given E. And we want to kind of see how those balance. Now, at least in my speech, I probably won't go into huge detail on this, and so you don't need to be too scared off or anything. But I'm just going to explain how this works a little bit. So the idea is that our final calculation, the probability of the resurrection given the evidence, is going to be a balance between two factors. And the first of these factors is this middle. Actually, to make it simpler, the first of these factors is the one on the right-hand side. And this is just the ratio of the probability of the resurrection over the probability that the resurrection didn't happen. So what we want to do is, we want to find a probability for the resurrection before we look at any of the evidence. And then we want to multiply it by this factor. And that will give us a final probability, which is the probability of the resurrection given the evidence. And philosophers and logicians will typically talk of this as the prior probability of the resurrection, and this is the posterior probability of the resurrection. And that means that this is the probability prior to looking at the evidence, and this is the probability posterior, after looking at the evidence. And the way we assess this is we have, like I said, we have this ratio of prior probabilities, and we multiply them by this middle factor. And this is the probability of the evidence given the resurrection, divided by the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection didn't happen. Now, just to explain how that might work and how we go about doing this, and why it makes sense. If the resurrection explains the evidence, if, for example, the resurrection explains the empty tomb and things like that, which I'm going to be talking about in my speech, and Greg might say a little bit about it as well, then this top factor might be quite big. But if the resurrection didn't happen, at least Christians will say that the evidence is very surprising. It's very surprising that there would be an empty tomb, that the disciples would start Christianity and so on, if the resurrection didn't happen. I'm trying to make this neutral, so Greg might dispute that a little bit, but that's the idea behind it. The idea is that Christians will want to say, if they want to justify belief in the resurrection, that the probability of the evidence, if the resurrection didn't happen, is very low. If the resurrection didn't happen, it's very unlikely that we'd have this evidence. And so what that would mean is that this bottom factor is very low. So if we have a high number for this top factor and a low number for this bottom factor, then the whole factor will be quite a big number. And if we multiply quite a big number by the prior probability of the resurrection, we find that the posterior probability of the resurrection is a lot higher than it was before. And that's roughly how the evidence works. I hope I've explained it at least enough for you to kind of get the gist throughout mine and Greg's talks, but if Greg wants to add anything, I'll let him do so now.
Yeah, can I have it?
You can change to yours, yeah.
Okay. Give me a second. So to make it complicated for you, I'm going to use a different version of Bayes' theorem. But they're equivalent. This looks different. So here, forgetting about the resurrection, this is just general. Here's any hypothesis H. The probability of H given evidence E is equal to what Callum rightly called the prior probability of H times what I call the explanatory likelihood, the ability of H to explain the evidence E. You find this in the numerator, the denominator, but you also find the denominator the same thing for not H. You have to look at the opposite hypothesis. So where Callum was talking about R and not R, and by the way, he's using the turnstile. Just so we don't totally confuse you, I'm using the tilde, he's using the turnstile. They're two different symbols for the same thing, right? They're both equally valid. So this is more general, and you can substitute anything in here for H besides the resurrection. So that's one form. Then to complicate it even more for you, if you don't have just two hypotheses, but you have a whole bunch, so let H be the resurrection hypothesis. These might be all the alternatives to it, such as the swoon theory, mass hallucination theory, the theft of the body in the tomb theory, the twin theory, things like that. Then these would fit into here. So there are more complicated versions, but we're not going to get too. Okay. We're out of time. Okay. So now you have your 5-minute introduction.
Thanks. So the important thing to remember and keep in mind is that the probability of the resurrection given the evidence is a combination of two factors. It will be how well the resurrection explains the evidence compared to how well alternative theories explain the evidence. And then the other factor is the prior probability, and that's what we mean by prior probability. How likely is it that the resurrection would happen before looking at the evidence? And so those are the really main important things that we'll need to keep in mind. And as long as you've roughly got the gist of that, then we should be able to keep up. So, about me. You will notice that this slide is completely empty. I assure you that I'm slightly more interesting than this, but not a huge amount. So Greg has given me 5 minutes to introduce myself. It probably won't take that long. There's not a huge amount to say. But I'm Callum Miller. I was born in London in the UK and grew up there, as most people do, before going to university. And I went to the University of Oxford to study there. And I'm still there, so I've started a 6-year course in medicine, which I'm just finishing up this year. So when I go back to the UK in August, I'll start work as a doctor. But I also have quite an interest in philosophy and theology and things like this, the application of probability to miracles and to the resurrection. And so I'm very interested in these kinds of questions as well. So I've published a couple of papers in the philosophy of religion as well, to try and keep my interest up in it. There's not too much else to say. I'm also a fairly normal guy. I like things like football and music and dancing, anything that other people enjoy doing. So I'm not kind of a purely academic kind of person, as much as I might give that impression sometimes. But that's just a little bit about me. So the last real thing is just to thank people, both the audience and everyone here for turning out, for Aaron Schellenberger at Charlotte, Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, for suggesting this debate and putting it on. Thank you to Cyprus for hosting me and to Greg for agreeing to debate. And like I say, thank you to everyone for being here. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm willing, and I assume Greg is willing, to stay around afterwards if you want to continue talking about these things or if there's something you didn't understand. Greg's nodding at me now, so I assume we'll both be around afterwards if you want to follow up with questions or come and speak to us. Do feel very welcome. But that's pretty much everything I want to say about myself, so I'll hand over to Greg again now.
We're going to be switching back and forth between his and mine. So this is for Aaron. Aaron, if you're out there watching, I just want you to know this is for you. Okay? You asked it, you got it. I had planned in my background to talk about my far background, but I found something very disturbing when I was preparing for this debate on the internet. Timothy McGrew, who's a major player in the resurrection, has a video, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, which he gave on April 9th, 2012 at a church, and I have all the information here. He says, Robert Greg Cavan was fond of promoting the twin theory and actually tried this in a debate with my good friend Bill Craig, which I did back in 1995, and got destroyed so humiliatingly that I am told he is willing to debate about the resurrection, but he doesn't use that theory, and he stipulates it as a condition of his going into the debate that he not be mentioned. He doesn't want to be reminded that he was once an advocate of this theory. Well, here's what I want you to know. This is a myth. It's completely false. I never said that. Never said anything like that. Callum, I had no condition with you that we not talk about the twin theory, correct? Yes. So I just want you to know, this is, I don't know what the source is that McGrew got, but I never made that stipulation except in one debate. That was Michael Kona, and that's only because I wanted to talk about the absurdities of the twin theory itself. That was why I made the stipulation. I want you to know I can't claim credit for the twin theory. It actually comes from Dr. Paul Meyer, a historian at Western Michigan University, in a book he wrote in 1973 called The First Easter. He himself does not advocate that theory, but he came up with it. I read about it, and so I worked it into my dissertation, my debate with Craig. He said, and I quote Meyer, of all the wild theories, that's the only one that would make a modicum of sense to me. Well, I think he's right in a way, except I don't think the twin theory is as wild as the resurrection theory. I think the theory that Jesus had an identical twin is absurd, but I think it's still much, much less absurd than the resurrection theory itself. I won my debate with Craig, I would say, by making that point. My point was, the most important point was, if you accept all the evidence that Callum's going to present tonight, then you're going to have to accept the twin theory, okay? I also want you to know we invited William Lane Craig and Michael Licona to this debate with no stipulations of any kind at all. Both declined, and Callum accepted. So I just want you to know that fact. then if anyone should believe the twin theory, it should be Timothy McGrew, because he's the one who believes the disciples had polymodal, interactive, parallel sensory experiences of the risen Jesus. And I will argue that if Callum believes that too, he too should believe in the twin theory, right? I will be pleased to debate the twin theory with Timothy McGrew anytime you'd like, open invitation. I'd be happy to debate hallucinations, space aliens, ghosts, anything else absurd you can think of, okay? What I'd really like to debate McGrew on is the myth-legend theory. I'd like to show him that it's more probable the Bible is myth and legend than it is that Jesus rose from the dead. What I want you to see here is even top Christian scholars don't bother to check the facts. Timothy McGrew didn't. So what I said back in 2012 was I didn't want to debate the twin theory with Mike Licona only. Some unknown source told Timothy McGrew that I said I never wanted to debate it again. McGrew put that on his videotape, and now this has gone around the whole world. So what I want you to see is Christians don't check their facts. And when you don't check your facts, you get legends. And I'm going to be showing you today exactly how we get legends with the Bible. Okay? So, one last thing. My debate will differ from my other two debates. This time, I'm going to be showing the prior probability of the resurrection is low. I'm going to be showing that the resurrection lacks power to explain the evidence that Callum's going to present. I'll show that the evidence is not really evidence at all. It's myth and legend. And then I will give a Bayesian argument for a version of the legend theory. Okay, so yours.
Let's check this works. Great. Okay, so this will be my opening speech now, so I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. I hope you don't get too bored, but I'll dig right in so that we minimize the chances of that. I'm going to begin with a story. So the year is around 4 BC. A small, rowdy, but unimportant corner of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is lord over Rome, most of northern Africa, the Mediterranean, Europe, and Israel. It's an unhappy arrangement. Most Jews begrudgingly submit to their de facto king, while others violently resist. In a small countryside of shepherds, fishermen, and outcasts, a baby is born. He grows up modestly, submitting to his parents and working as a manual labourer in a nearby town. 30 years pass, and he might well have lived and died with no one ever knowing. But one day things change. This nobody finds a few other nobodies fishing, and they join him. He performs miracles, not to the important people or to kings, but to peasants. Not to win acclamation, but to heal and to serve. There are no megachurches, no flashing lights, and no #1 Yeezy album. He reaches out to oppressed women, to untouchables, and to other outcasts, healing them and inviting them to join his kingdom. To join not for material gain, but for friendship with himself, the king. And this is a king who bends to wash the feet of his subjects and humiliates himself so that the last, the least, and the lost can be honoured. And so important people from the city begin to hear things about him. They ask, who is this king? Who is this person who thinks they can change law and who can call themselves king? Who is it who touches the unclean in this way? And so they go to him, they test him, and they say, who is the king? Do we pay taxes to the king Caesar? If he says yes, then he gets killed by the Jews. And if he says no, he gets killed by the Romans. So Jesus asks whose image the coin they're talking about bears. They tell him it bears Caesar's image. And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The coin bears Caesar's image, but you bear God's image. Caesar can have his coin, but I want you who hate me and try to kill me. And so his disciples later protest, Lord, call down fire on them. And Jesus' best friend even goes to kill one of his arresters. But Jesus rebukes him and heals the man. Love your enemies, he tells them. Real enemies, those who arrest you and try to crucify you. And as Jesus claims kingship and divine authority, as he judges the important religious people for hating their enemies and outcasts, they kill him. They give him a death so excruciating and lonely that Roman citizens were exempt from it. A death so shameful that Hebrew law regarded the crucified as accursed by God. And so the movement was dead. The wannabe king died as he was born, a lonely, rejected loser from Nazareth. But a few days later, something interesting happened. Those who followed him and abandoned him began to preach that he was alive and that he was king. Those who had rejected him all along began to say the same thing. This band of losers from the Galilean countryside traveled across Europe, Asia, and Africa, declaring that this crucified criminal and blaspheming peasant had been raised from the dead. People from the lakes of Galilee and from the high council in Jerusalem began to throw their lives down for him. They shared any riches they had with the poor, prayed for their enemies, were thrown into prison, and killed with stones and crosses, so that a few decades later, bishops in France were writing, "Come fire and cross, come hacking off of limbs, come crushing of my whole body, and come the cruel tortures of the devil. Only let me reach Jesus Christ." And the invitation they had was this: come to join this kingdom with a king who sits not on lofty thrones, but nailed to a cross by his own subjects. A kingdom that prevails against the corrupt, greedy, and violent kingdoms and states of this world. A kingdom that endures against suffering and even against death itself. A kingdom that offers such freedom that those who join it endure in it against all afflictions, and such freedom that comes from friendship with the king himself. A freedom from the shackles of shame or guilt, from the need for popularity, from the longing for reputation or acceptance, and from any other secret addiction to money, sex, or whatever else we long for and beat ourselves up over. And so this is a real challenge. The king of the kingdom tells me that I must love my enemies and forgive those who wrong me. He tells me that if I don't have time for the most unimportant, lowest person I come across, then I don't have time for the king of the world himself. That's the kind of radical acceptance he asks for. But following this crucified servant king is a challenge that many from the very start have accepted, and with it changed the world. And so the question now is, how did this all happen? What led this band of outcasts, council members, and Romans to go willingly to their deaths in the name of a public embarrassment, Jesus? I'm going to be arguing that the evidence we have strongly suggests that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his ministry and start a movement following him. So let me split the evidence into two. Firstly, we have what I'll call direct evidence for the resurrection. This includes all the evidence we have about Jesus' death and burial and the beginning of early Christianity and what the disciples claimed about him having an empty tomb and appearing to them. Then we have a variety of indirect evidence. The most important for today's discussion are the top two, the evidence of Jesus' ministry and the evidence of Jesus' character. But I want to at least note that there is other evidence that I won't have time to talk about. So let me turn to the first piece of direct evidence relevant to the case at hand, the death of Jesus by crucifixion. This fact is so uncontested in historical scholarship that even the liberal scholar John Dominic Crossan writes, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Historians have a staggering amount of source material for this event. Not only is Jesus' death attested in every single New Testament and early Christian writing, it is multiply attested in non-Christian literature, including Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar, Serapion, and the Jewish Talmud. Moreover, the stories about Jesus' death are incredibly unlikely to have been made up, given how embarrassing and contrary to expectation the crucifixion was. Crucifixion was a humiliating fate for a messianic leader, and the narratives are full of embarrassing details about the disciples, including their betrayal, including their being rebuked by Jesus, and including their failure to believe Jesus' teaching about his own death. Moreover, it's not difficult to see why Jesus would have been crucified. Immediately before, in just the few days preceding, he rode into Jerusalem on a colt, indicating and implying that he was the Messiah of Israel. He declared judgment on the temple establishment by driving the traders out and telling parables against them. And he was given a messianic anointing by a woman in Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem. So his judgment against the temple establishment gave the Jewish authorities enough reason to have him killed. And his claims to messiahship, to be a king of Israel, could have had him killed as a political threat to the Romans. And finally, the sheer detail in the story supports their veracity, especially since the details fit with secular history. We have, for example, multiple records from Roman history of something akin to the Passover pardon, where Barabbas was freed. And we have multiple records of mockery, very similar to that endured by Jesus at his crucifixion. So I think there's a very strong case for Jesus' death. The second piece of evidence is the evidence regarding Jesus' burial. The evidence, I think, is considerably stronger than is usually imagined. And I'm going to argue that even if we had no specific testimonial evidence regarding the burial of Jesus, it would still be almost certain that he was buried in a known tomb. The evidence for this is as follows. In Second Temple Judaism, there was an overwhelming obligation to bury the dead, regardless of whether they were allies or enemies. This obligation was partly out of honor to the dead themselves, and partly to avoid defiling the land of Israel. In the Torah, for example, the first 5 books of the Hebrew and Christian Bible, God himself commands that anyone capitally punished must be buried properly. specifically to avoid defiling the land. This wasn't something that only applied to righteous Jews, it applied to criminals because it was about the land not being defiled. So there was nothing suggesting that criminals would not receive a proper burial. If anything, because being hung from a tree, according to Deuteronomy, means that one is cursed by God, there is more reason to bury criminals so that the land is not defiled. This sentiment is followed up throughout the Old Testament with similar sentiments, and also into the intertestamental period in the book of Tobit and in the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in Israel. In the 1st century, Philo and Josephus repeat the sentiments again. In later rabbinical writings, a few centuries later, in Midrash and also in the Talmud, the same necessity for proper burial is emphasized. In Sifri, which is a piece of Jewish Midrash, even a high priest of Israel is obliged to bury the dead if no one else is around to do it. And throughout these writings, as well as in the death of John the Baptist and in the Roman Digesta, which is a Roman kind of law book, the burial of criminals is allowed and commanded. So moving on. Importantly, in these documents outside the Bible, mandatory and common parts of Jewish burial are made very clear throughout. Jews were to have their bones collected 1 year later, a process known as ossulegium, for collection in an ossuary, a box of bones, ready for the final resurrection. In the case of criminals, ossuaries would also be taken to the family tomb 1 year later, since immediate burial in the family tomb was not permitted. Public mourning for criminals was also prohibited, but private mourning was allowed. Indeed, excavations have actually found in the Jerusalem area deeper parts of tombs so that people could pray standing up according to the Jewish custom. Moreover, perfumes and spices would also typically be taken to the tomb during or shortly after burial. And in the case of respected holy men, tomb veneration would be another reason to specifically note the location of the tomb. So even if there weren't these numerous specific reasons to specifically remember the location of the tomb, it's probable that those who buried Jesus just 1 or 2 days before would have simply remembered where they buried him. But here we have a very large number of incredibly important reasons for specifically noting the location of the tomb of a criminal like Jesus. So this makes it almost certain historically that Jesus would have been buried in a known and remembered tomb. I'd also just point very briefly to the fact that there's archaeological evidence for this. So we have the archaeological remnants of crucifixion and other execution victims from the time of Jesus. So the crucifixion victim, Yehohanan, for example, is from the late 20s under the reign of Pontius Pilate. Then I can talk about some of the archaeological evidence as well. So when we look at the direct testimonial evidence, after looking at that evidence, we find that there are additional reasons to believe that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. The circumstances, being in Jerusalem at Passover and being condemned by the Jewish authorities specifically, provide extra reason to obey the purity rites of Jewish law with respect to burial. The details of the burial fit with what we are told in non-Christian historical sources. Jesus' body had to be granted by Pontius Pilate in accordance with Roman law. It was buried by nightfall in a tomb given by the Sanhedrin in accordance with Jewish rabbinical law. And it was in a tomb with a circular sealing stone, a fairly common way of sealing tombs in the period. And it's also plausible that a custodian would be present at the tomb to prohibit public mourning and to make sure that burial rites were observed properly, given the numerous restrictions on burial law. So also bear in mind the multiple attestation to the burial tradition in the Gospels and in the epistles in the New Testament. In particular, the early source material used by Mark in his Gospel includes the burial story. And the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which scholars think goes back to within a couple of years of the crucifixion, also has the burial tradition in there. So there's multiple independent attestation here. Note also that Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb Jesus was buried in, as a member of the council responsible for Jesus' death, is unlikely to have been a Christian invention. And note also the complete lack of a competing burial story and a complete lack of tomb veneration or any similar tradition, indicating that Jesus' tomb was well known if we put this all together. So given the evidence, Jesus' burial in a known tomb is beyond historical doubt. So far, so good. So we can now turn to explain the rise of early Christianity. It's uncontroversial that from a very early age, Christians were proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus around the Mediterranean. Let me briefly explain some of the biases Jesus' followers and others had against believing in a resurrection. Firstly, the Messiah of Israel was supposed to be a warrior king defeating the Romans in military battle. A dead Messiah meant a false Messiah, and a crucified man meant a cursed man. A crucified wannabe Messiah is no Messiah at all. Moreover, there was no change in the relationship between Israel and Rome. Nothing suggested that Jesus had been a successful Messiah by normal Jewish standards. Everything suggested otherwise. In addition, there was absolutely no expectation of any resurrection before the end of the world. Greco-Romans didn't believe in resurrection. The Sadducees in Judaism didn't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees did, but only at the very end of the world. So the idea of a resurrection before the end of the world was completely alien to any Jew, and it was laughed at by people who the early Christians spoke to about it. Moreover, the Jews knew about brief hallucinations. They knew that people had visions occasionally when people died, and they wouldn't have called them resurrections. They had theological ways of explaining these visions and other special kinds of feelings, including exaltation, apparitions, being in Abraham's bosom, which is a way of them referring to where righteous Jews went to when they died, and so on. Resurrection was something entirely different. But the concept moved from a peripheral belief in parts of Judaism to a central part of the new movement, according to which the meaning of the term was clear. It's clear simply from the meaning of resurrection that any Jew willing to undergo such a radical shift in their beliefs against all their cognitive biases must have had a very compelling and determinate experience to convince them that someone had been raised from the dead. Even more so for a whole group of Jews. They must have had ostensible appearances of Jesus, risen from the dead, more compelling than mere feelings or grief visions. They must have been able to have conversed with him, spoken with him, touched him, all in one go. They must have been able to verify these visions with each other. And given their knowledge of the tomb's location, it is unthinkable that they would risk their lives by proclaiming the resurrection without even checking that the tomb was empty. It's even more unthinkable that the Jewish authorities would let them continue to preach the resurrection without checking the tomb themselves. So even before we look at specific detailed testimonial accounts, mere reflection on the beginning of Christianity makes it overwhelmingly probable that Jesus' followers and others must have found his tomb empty, and they must have had extremely robust and public appearances of Jesus in order to risk their lives proclaiming his resurrection. But of course, we have far more than that. For the empty tomb, we have primarily the testimony of women. Women's testimony was so dismissed in Jewish culture that the only time it was not considered worthless is if there was no other testimony available. If the stories about the empty tomb were made up, they would not have cited women as the primary witnesses. But the testimony of the women is cited in all four Gospels, stark and unsanitized. Again, this includes the very early source material used by Mark in his Gospel. And the empty tomb is also implied by other early resurrection creeds and sermons, as in 1 Corinthians 15 and Acts 2 in Peter's sermon. Moreover, the narrative is simple with very little embellishment, and they are devoid of theologizing and theological reflection, and they're devoid of scriptural references. This suggests that there is a very early source behind them. There are even independent sources suggesting that the Jewish authorities themselves confirmed an empty tomb, both in Matthew's Gospel and in early Christian literature like Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. So there's good evidence from the enemies, people who were opposing the resurrection, that they agreed that the empty tomb was a fact. Moreover, the radical, multiply attested cultural shift from resting on Saturday, the Sabbath, to Sunday, the Lord's Day, also counts as strong evidence in favour of the narrative where the disciples found Jesus' tomb empty on the Sunday morning. And as I previously discussed, the burial tradition and proclamation of the resurrection strongly supports the empty tomb story. And this evidence leads the atheist historian Michael Grant to say, if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. And so finally, as I have argued, the rise of Christianity makes it overwhelmingly probable that Jesus' followers and others had robust public experiences of what they took to be Jesus. Otherwise, they would not have proclaimed Jesus' resurrection and risked their lives in the first place, given their historical context. But we also have specific detailed evidence that they had such appearances. Jesus' followers and others had multiple experiences of Jesus according to many different accounts throughout different Gospels, the book of Acts and New Testament epistles. These include appearances not only to Jesus' followers, but to those who thought he was crazy or a false prophet during his ministry, such as his brother James and the zealous Pharisee Paul. The very early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, dating back to within a few years of the crucifixion, includes an appearance to 500 people and indicates that many of these eyewitnesses were still alive and available for verification. The narratives in the Gospels themselves are multiple, independent, and detailed. They include obscure details which we would not expect if they were fabricated completely. They cohere in incidental details with other parts of Jesus' life in independent sources. They are far from what we would expect if they were simply projections of the Old Testament and intertestamental period. Jesus does not conform to any of the visions of resurrection as given there, but he is a relatively humble individual, not shining like a star as the Old Testament book of Daniel might have envisaged. The appearances to women are also recorded, which would not be expected if the narratives were made up. As with the stories of the empty tomb, there is no embellishment, theological reflection, or scriptural references. The stories are basic and simple. And as I have mentioned, it is nigh impossible that the disciples would have believed in Jesus' resurrection had they not had these apparent experiences of him. And so all of this leads the atheist New Testament historian Gerd Ludemann to conclude, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. He, of course, doesn't believe that it was actually Jesus, but he's saying it's historically certain that the disciples had experiences of what they took to be Jesus after he had died. So, finally, what does this all mean? I've argued that it's almost certain historically that after Jesus was crucified, he was buried in a known tomb, and that the same tomb was found shortly after, empty. While Jesus' followers and others had appearances of what they thought was Jesus, I have argued that even before looking at the specific testimonial evidence found in the biblical documents, we should regard these as virtually certain historically. But if we add the multiple independent accounts of these events in the biblical documents, the case is even more certain. So the remaining question is what these events mean. So if we revisit the probability formula myself and Greg introduced earlier, we can see what this evidence means. I said that the probability of the resurrection was partly related to how much direct evidence there is for the resurrection. And so the evidence that we have now is the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus to his followers and others. I argue that this evidence would be fairly probable if in fact Jesus rose from the dead. So if Jesus rose from the dead, we would expect an empty tomb because he would have vacated it. And it's plausible that he would have appeared to the people who knew him best, who would recognize him, his disciples and family. So let's say that this top factor is moderate, and we'll just arbitrarily stick in 0.5 for that factor. It doesn't matter too much for the purposes of my case. I'm sure Greg will dispute this later anyway. But I'm going to say the top factor is at least moderate. But the bottom factor is now, I think, once we reflect on the evidence, very low. Because the way we work this bottom factor out is that we multiply various improbabilities together. So this bottom factor, the probability of the evidence, given that the resurrection didn't happen, is the probability of Jesus' tomb being found empty, multiplied by the probability of Peter having these appearances of Jesus after his death, multiplied by the probability of James, Jesus' brother, having these appearances of Jesus after his death, and so on for the women, so on for the other 12, the rest of the 12 apostles, for people like Paul, and if we take the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 seriously, for the 500 that Jesus also ostensibly appeared to. And what happens when we multiply all these probabilities together is we get something extremely low, once we multiply them and multiply them and multiply them. But since the rival explanations of these phenomena are unconvincing, each one of these probabilities is very low. And when we multiply them all together, the overall probability is overwhelmingly low. So philosophers Timothy and Lydia McGrew, who Greg referred to earlier, even though they might have made a mistake about Greg's participating in debates because of whatever reasons, they've given a very rigorous, solid historical analysis of this. And just as an example, the figure they put on this bottom value is 1 over 10 to the power of 44. And this number at the bottom just means 1 with 44 zeros after it. That has obviously been disputed by numerous philosophers and others, but that's the kind of strength of evidence that some Christians would say we have. And I don't think it's wildly inaccurate. I think once we multiply all those improbabilities together, this bottom factor is extremely low, which means that once we multiply the prior probability of the resurrection by this enormous factor, we have very good evidence, and it's very likely in the end that the probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is very high. So the only way we can accept evidence this powerful and still hold that Jesus probably wasn't raised from the dead is to say that the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection is even lower than that, is even lower than, for example, 1 over 10 to the power of 44. I suspect, as well as disputing this figure, Greg will also try to give some argument for thinking that the prior probability is overwhelmingly low as well. I simply can't see any remotely plausible argument for this conclusion. but I'll leave that to Greg to offer to you. But for now, I just want to remind you of the introduction to Jesus that I gave earlier. This was no meaningless miracle. This was not God raising someone from the dead at random. This was no average human. If Jesus claimed divine authority to heal people, to change the Mosaic law, to forgive sins, if he gave radical and profound teaching, if he predicted his death and resurrection, and claimed to come specifically to reconcile humans to God, then we have to take him seriously as someone whom God might want to use to communicate with us. If, from a tiny fishing village in Galilee, he changed the world with his compassion, love, wisdom, and goodness, we have very good reason to think that God would want to raise him from the dead to defeat the final enemy, death. Thank you.
Second to set up here. Okay, I want to talk about 4 preliminaries really quickly. What most biblical scholars believe, never accept this because they're not Bayesians. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay, Craig is very fond of telling us what most biblical scholars believe. But if their arguments are not based on Bayes' theorem, you can't accept their arguments. Plus, equally qualified experts disagree. There's the myth of core facts, which Callum is giving us, core facts. But again, if you examine the argument for the core facts, they're not Bayesian arguments, they're fallacious. Okay, and all these people, Habermas, Craig, Stephen Davis, Michael Licona, Timothy, and Lydia McGrew, although they give a Bayesian argument, they don't give a Bayesian argument for E. They assume E, all right? And Richard Swinburne. These facts need to be proven. They have not been proven. They need to be proven using Bayes' theorem, not non-Bayesian arguments. Also, I want to talk about the fallacy of Blooming probabilities very quickly. Suppose that B is probable on A and C is probable on B. Does it follow from this that C is probable on A? And the answer is it does not follow at all. To show that, you have to have a high degree of probability of B on A and on C on A and B to get a C on A being higher than 0.5. The kind of arguments that Callum has been talking about leading up to using Bayes' theorem commit dwindling probabilities. They argue the probability of B on A is high, C on B is high, D on C is high, etc., so forth, but they end up getting a very low final probability. They would have to have probabilities of all these things almost to 1, even to get a probability of 1/2 of Z on A. So you have to be very cautious of these arguments, informal arguments, to build on top of each other. We never get that high probability. I'm going to be saying throughout this entire argument I'm going to be giving, what's more probable? I'm going to fill in various things for X, or a man rose from the dead. I'm going to argue that X is going to be more probable than a man rose from the dead in every case. I first want to talk about the resurrection theory having an astronomically low prior probability. My argument is based on negative natural theology, NNT, and it's based on the fact, well, think about this. Hey, I just got back from the cemetery. I was bringing these flowers for Uncle John, but when I got there, he'd just risen from the dead. If I were to say that, it's a bad joke. We all know that resurrection from the dead is highly improbable. The question is, how highly improbable is it? It is the one item of our bona fide background information that's relevant to the resurrection, okay? So our everyday empirical observations, crude observational frequencies, reveal that God, if he exists, has an extremely small tendency to raise the dead. Now, the problem is observational frequencies are too crude to give us precise probabilities, but they do show at the very least that it's improbable. Now, I'm going to argue it's astronomically improbable. We need something better than crude observational frequencies. So let's turn to our well-confirmed scientific theories. These show that God, if he exists, has an astronomically small tendency to raise the dead. This is negative natural theology. Now, to see why supernatural intervention by God is antecedently improbable, we have to turn to natural theology, specifically what is known as the via negativa. Even St. Augustine said nature is the will of God. Moses Maimonides said we can learn about God by seeing what he is not. That's the way of negation. God's self-revelation in nature shows that he has an exceptionally strong tendency not to supernaturally intervene in the affairs of nature, raise people from the dead. He reveals in everyday experience and in science that he possesses an extremely, exceptionally strong tendency not to supernaturally raise people from the dead. So we can use this and apply it to Jesus. It's clear that the prior probability of specifically a supernatural resurrection of Jesus is astronomically low. Now, without trying to wow you by scientific facts, let me talk really quickly about the science of statistical mechanics, which Callum debated Peter Atkins. He'll know all about statistical mechanics. So statistical mechanics divides up reality into what are called macrostates, microstates. Microstates are ways of achieving a macrostate. A macrostate would being alive, another macrostate would being dead. There's countless ways in which a body can be dead, but only a very few ways in which a body can be alive. So when you're dealing with microstates of death, these outweigh the number of microstates of life gazillions to one. So let's take a look at my little animation here of a person dying. The reason why we die, and the reason why we stay dead when we die, is that there's more ways of arranging our particles in a dead conformation than there is a living conformation. And by the same token, if we have random particles, it is very improbable for those to form into a human being who's alive. Now, this entails that it's very, very improbable, astronomically improbable, that God would raise someone from the dead. He can raise someone from the dead. I'm not disputing that. But it's highly improbable a priori that God would do that. And we're dealing with a priori probabilities here. So we have gazillions of dead states. We have only a few living states. And so the overwhelming tendency is for things to die and stay dead, not to come alive again. For this reason, the prior probability of the resurrection is astronomically low. Now, would God overcome these? Would God raise Jesus from the dead anyway? Well, what would God do? WWGD, right? Okay. How probable is it that God would raise Jesus from the dead? Positive natural theology, Richard Swinburne uses this, and I believe Callum is using it too. They offer reasons to hold that God might deviate from his normal astronomical tendency of raising the dead to raise Jesus. 3 reasons are given. It would vindicate Jesus as God incarnate who provides profound teaching, identifies with our suffering, and provides atonement for sin, and thereby escape from hell. Now, this vindication hasn't worked, because most of the world is not Christian. So if that was God's plan, it's failed. God doesn't fail in what he does. We don't need profound teaching. We know already what's right and wrong. We don't need any kind of teaching on that. Our suffering still remains, and justice and forgiveness do not require atonement. In fact, hell, eternal hell, is unjust. The punishment does not fit the crime. So hell turns a just, loving God into a murdering thug, your money or your life. God is no murdering thug. Hell turns a just, loving God into Adolf Hitler. Join the Nazi party, little girl, or I'm going to kill you, right? Hell turns a just, loving God into Darth Sidious, right? Follow me or be destroyed. That is the doctrine of hell. So we don't need Jesus to rise from the dead to prove all this, because this is not the way God operates. Notice for Christians, hell is no worry, right? They have a sordid history of burning heretics like me to the stake, right? That would be me a couple of 100 years ago, right? Thank God it's not now. And they have no problem with hell. The Bible is full of references to hell. Now, Callum has a blog in which he doubts that hell exists, but I will tell you the scriptures are completely clear on this. Later on, when we have more time to cover facts, we can go back and look at these passages. But I'm just giving you some examples. So here's what the idea. God needs to raise us from the dead to avoid this. But why would God do this to us in the first place? It would be completely unjust, right? No matter, even Adolf Hitler, no matter how bad a sinner you've been, does not deserve an eternity in hell. The eternity does not match the crime done. So, turn to Jesus or burn in hell forever. Well, that's like your money or your life, right? That's not fitting of God, okay? John Hick, I think, has a much better theodicy, the soul-making theodicy. He argues that hell, unending torment, would be utterly pointless, wasted suffering, pain that's never redeemed and worked into God's fulfilling God's good purpose. God would not allow that, so God would not allow hell. Therefore, we don't need atonement, we don't need redeeming in that sense. Okay? So I think the considerations of positive natural theology are insufficient to overcome those of negative natural theology and show that the prior probability of the resurrection is not astronomically low. Let me talk about the resurrection theory lacks explanatory power. Callum argues it has. I think it has zip power. Okay? Now, I first want to point out that resurrectionists use R equivocally. They use it to mean two different things. They define sometimes, the McGrews, for instance, define R to mean God miraculously raised Jesus from the dead, yet not R is not defined to mean God did not raise Jesus from the dead. It's defined to mean the body of Jesus did not remain dead. We have an equivocation here, and it leads to a paradox. That means there are two kinds of skeptics. Skeptics who believe that Jesus never became alive again, and skeptics who do believe he did become alive again, just to a cause other than God. So in other words, R is defined in ways that are incompatible with the way skeptics. My hypothesis is this, not this. But the way Callum and the McGrews and Swinburne define R, they define it equivocally. Let's turn to David Hume, Treatise of Human Nature, and Inquiry Concerning Understanding. The problem of cause and effect in the resurrection theory is any kind of explanation. Hume says that causes and effects are discoverable not by reason, but only by experience, is obvious in the case of causes altogether unknown to us, since there's no way of foretelling what effects will arise from them. One can never find the effect in the supposed cause, even by the most meticulous examination of it. For the effect is totally different from the cause, and because it is, can never be discovered in it. For the effect, I'm sorry, I repeat myself, there is no way to discover a priori that gunpowder explodes. We had to have experience of gunpowder before we knew what it would do. There's no way to discover a priori that magnets attract iron. Before we first had magnets, we didn't know what they would do. We had no idea. We fancied that if we were brought on a sudden into this world, we could immediately infer that one billiard ball would cause motion in another upon hitting it without having to wait to see whether it did have this effect. So we all expect to see this, but before experience, maybe it would be this way. Maybe it would be this way, right? Maybe it would be this. We have no way of knowing what effects will come from what causes prior to experience, okay? This is Hume's beautiful point. Now, what about the resurrection of Jesus? Well, it's clear from St. Paul that the resurrection body of Jesus is a spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15:35 through 50. We have no experience of spiritual bodies. We have experience of physical bodies, but not spiritual bodies. We have absolutely no experience of any kind of what a spiritual body will do. What are spiritual bodies? Do they consist of matter or schmatter? Are they made of atoms or schmatoms? There's no way to know. Are spiritual bodies visible or invisible? Well, we've never seen one, we can't say. Are they audible or inaudible? We've never seen one, we can't say. Are they tangible or intangible? We've never seen one, we can't say. Atom Jesus can be seen because light is reflected off his body. But schmatum Jesus can't be seen because he's not made of atoms. Light goes right through him. Mary says, where is he, right? There's no observational difference between the two, right? Does schmatum Jesus fall down to the earth because gravity pulls him down and the earth doesn't support it? Well, we have no way of knowing because we don't know what a spiritual body would be like. Would Mary try to grab onto Jesus and her hand pass through his body? Would he appear negative, right? Would he appear like this? Well, we have no idea what a spiritual body is, so we can't say what effects. Would there be an empty tomb with a spiritual body? Well, let me ask you this. How many spiritual bodies have you looked at lately and seen what effects they have? And that would be none, right? So Callum is making a huge, massive assumption here that the resurrection can explain anything at all. It can't, because we have no experience of resurrection bodies. Do spiritual bodies cast reflections in mirrors? Can spiritual bodies interact with the physical universe, right? Are they subject to gravitational force, electroweak force? We don't know because we've never seen one, okay? Do those possessing spiritual bodies retain their personalities and their memories when they're raised, or do they have to start all over again with a whole new personality? Would they remember who they are? Would Jesus say, oh yeah, I'm Jesus, or would you say, who am I? Right? We have no way of knowing. Do those possessing spiritual bodies prefer to leave their tombs? Do they prefer to stay in them? For all you know, people in spiritual bodies like tombs. We have no way of knowing they don't. Do those possessing spiritual bodies want to reunite with their loved ones, or would they rather eat their loved ones? Again, we have no way of knowing. There is no way to give either a yes or no answer to any of these questions or a host of similar ones because we have no experience of any kind of spiritual bodies. We have no experience of resurrection bodies. Thus, believers have no grounds for claiming that the resurrection is a good explanation for the empty tomb, if there was an empty tomb, and post-mortem experiences. We have no reason to say that at all. I would say it's even wrong to call the resurrection theory a theory. It's really an empty blank waiting for a genuine theory to be put into it, because so far no one has ever explained the key notion of it. Christians equivocate resuscitation and resurrection. And when they equivocate, they think they know what the consequences are, they don't. Now, I have a solution to these problems. Switch from R to D. Let D be the theory that the corpse of Jesus undergoes the complete course of post-mortem decomposition over the course of the history of the universe. Let not D be the opposing theory that the corpse of Jesus does not undergo the complete course of post-mortem decomposition. Now, not D space is virtually identical to D space. In fact, I have a little drawing here for you. Here's, right, not D space, and R occupies only a small microscopic dot of not D space. Otherwise, D space and not D space are the same thing. So, where easy alleged evidence that Callum has nicely laid out for us, I would argue, forgetting about R because we've seen R as equivocal, it has paradoxes, we don't know what consequences follow on R, but we do on D and not D. What I would say is the probability of the empty tomb and the appearances on D is almost the same as it is on not D, because again, not D space is almost identical to D space. R occupies the most small, astronomically small particle of it. Number one, the probability of D is much greater than not D. We know that by what I talked about earlier. So here you have a Bayesian argument that the probability that Jesus went through the entire course of post-mortem decomposition given E, and is still doing so, is greater than 1/2. And since, of course, D entails not R, it follows immediately that the probability of R on E is less than much less than 1/2. So this would be my Bayesian argument against the resurrection, based on the problems with R and the non-problems with D and not D. Let's move on to the alleged evidence isn't really evidence at all for the resurrection. As Callum talked about, the empty tomb, the Gospels, the polymodal interactive parallel integrated sensory experience of the risen Jesus with various witnesses, all this is myth, okay? Here's Timothy McGrew saying that we had these multimodal sensory experiences. You can read this later. I'm going to have this at infidels.org. Same thing here, Jesus interacting, eating with people. There are serious issues that arise for all of these resurrectionist claims that you should know about. First of all, where was the risen Jesus located in the appearances? Was he already up in heaven, or was he still down on the earth? Where were the witnesses? In Galilee, or were they in Jerusalem, already in Galilee? Did the appearances take place 6 months after Easter, or for a 40-day period beginning with Easter? What was the mode of the appearances? Were they feelings of presence, trances, visions, or sensory experiences, as Callum is assuming? What kind of body did the risen Jesus have, spiritual or physical? Well, I'm going to give thumbs up to all the top ones, thumbs down to all the bottom ones, okay? So let's talk about the sources. Which sources provide eyewitness testimony? How much time do I have left? 3 minutes? Ooh, that's bad. Okay. Well, we may have to do this in phases. So I want you to first of all see we only have one eyewitness, and this is St. Paul. He's the only person who wrote anything at all for someone who actually said he saw the risen Jesus. If we turn here to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, we will find these are non-eyewitness testimony. We have a man by the name of Eusebius from Caesarea who quotes someone called Papias of Hierapolis, who quotes an unknown source called John the Elder. John the Elder apparently told Papias 2 things. I'm losing my ability to put this down. That is that Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew was the author of the Gospel of Matthew. But what you can see here is we have a late source quoting an earlier source who quotes an unknown source. We have no reason to accept this. Luke himself tells us he was not an eyewitness. And we have Irenaeus of Lyon, who is, again, a very late source, telling us Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. But again, this is a very late source, so we have no reason to believe these sources. We have no reason to believe the Gospels offer any kind of eyewitness testimony. Let's talk about another major problem with the Gospels. Do I have time for this or no? In terms of parity of time, 1 minute, or just might fit 20 minutes? Okay, I'll go just a little longer. I want to show you how the three other Gospels intentionally changed the Gospel of Mark to invent fiction and contradictory Easter stories. If you're reading the Gospel of Mark, you'll see here that Jesus, on the Mount of Olives, just before he was arrested, says, "After I'm raised up, I'll go before you to Galilee." The next page, we have Mary Magdalene and the other women at the tomb. The angel says, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee." However, when the women leave the tomb, they went out and fled from the tomb. Trembling and astonishment had come upon them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Look at their faces. The women said nothing to anyone because they were terrified of what happened. Now that's Mark, and that is the end of the Gospel of Mark. Now, this creates a huge problem. If the women said nothing to anyone, then how would the disciples know to go to Galilee to see Jesus? They wouldn't. So Mark and Luke have their own solutions to the problem. Matthew offers the following solution. Edit Mark. Cut out the fear of the women. Have Jesus meet the women at the tomb. Tell them to go to Galilee. And that way I can still have the disciples see Jesus in Galilee the way Mark wanted. So here's what we have in Matthew's gospel. We have a beautiful story with the women, with the angel. And by the way, the words are corrected to, "Lo, I have told you," because Jesus never actually told them in Mark he'd see them there. He just said he'd go before them. So here's what we have now. They departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, ran to tell his disciples. Behold, Jesus met them and said, "Hail." They came up, took his feet, worshipped him. Here's what's been cut out of Mark, the fear of the women. So Matthew cuts out of Mark that entire section and replaces it with his own. He adds just one word from Jesus. "Don't be afraid, go tell my brethren to go to Galilee, they will see me." That's the only thing Jesus says to women. Then he takes off. They go tell the disciples. And finally, at the bottom here, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. And then Jesus says, "Baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." What I want you to see here, Matthew has made this up. Mark doesn't have it. Matthew wants to fulfill what Mark did not have. Now, if I can have just a minute or two more, let's go to Luke. I've got even a better idea. Don't edit Mark. Just forget him. Cut out Galilee and the two Marys entirely. I'll have Jesus find the disciples himself before they leave the larger Jerusalem area. So this is what Luke does. Luke changes what the angels say. "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee. Notice, he still uses these words, but he changes the context. So it's no longer "go to Galilee." It's "remember how he told you while he was in Galilee." So Luke changes completely what the angels say, contradicts what they said before. Then he invents a story of Jesus meeting Peter, and then Jesus meeting the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Notice this. In Matthew, Jesus says, "Tell them to go to Galilee." But on the same day, within minutes, now don't go to Galilee, stay in Jerusalem. We have complete, total contradiction. Luke wants everything in Jerusalem. Matthew wants it in Galilee. It's not that they're being historians. They made this stuff up. And of course, finally, in Luke, we have two different ascension stories. We have one ascension on Easter Sunday from Bethany. Wait 40 days, and now we have the ascension 40 days later on the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem. So what I want you to see is we cannot trust those sources. I'll stop at this point and continue on later. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Greg, for that talk. There was obviously a lot of material in there, and I can't guarantee by any means that I'll be able to respond to every single point, but I'll just do my best to go to as many points as possible and see where Greg has misled you all, if I might put it that way. The first, one of the things that Greg talks about is the idea of frequentism. This is the idea that we can get rough estimates of probabilities from frequencies observed in nature. And sometimes this is fairly reasonable and a fairly accurate thing to do. But it's fairly widely recognized among all logicians, statisticians, philosophers of probability and so on, that frequencies are only a good guide to probabilities in a given reference class. So for example, if you take the probability that any given person is bald, the probability might be 0.1. But if you find out more information about that person, for example, if we find out that we're talking about a man, the probability will go up. So the probability that any given man is bald might be higher, 0.2, 0.3, and so on. This quite clearly, I think, conveys the point that frequencies only work when we have a given reference class. Christians agree that the probability of God resurrecting any random person is low. But as I mentioned, we have extremely strong direct evidence for the resurrection, which may overcome prior improbability all on its own. And further, as I mentioned, we have extra evidence changing the reference class. Greg seemed to concede this to some extent in his talk, saying, actually, Jesus is slightly different from most other people. And that is, of course, the response I would say, that Jesus is no ordinary person who I think God just raised randomly. Rather, God had reason to raise Jesus from the dead in particular. And I gave some of those reasons earlier. This case is even stronger when we're talking about frequentism if we can explain why God acts unusually in some case. So in this case, we know why God would want to violate the normal course of nature, but because by doing so, as William Paley noted nearly 200 years ago now, that one of the best ways God can communicate with people and to make people recognize God is by performing a miracle against the normal laws of nature, something that no one else can normally do. This is one of the best ways God has of helping us to recognize him. And so the resurrectionist can easily explain why it is that normally dead people stay dead, and why it is nevertheless that we have good evidence to suppose that Jesus was raised from the dead. So I don't think this kind of frequentist argument should be very satisfying. Greg linked this to statistical mechanics to an extent. What I just say here is that the probability postulate Greg gathers from statistical mechanics is not a probability axiom in probability theory itself. It's not one of the Kolmogorov axioms of probability theory, and it doesn't follow from any of them. The reason microstates are all equally probable is a contingent fact. It is something that follows from a law of nature. So, if we assume that the laws of nature are operative in a given case, we should apply that kind of principle of indifference and assume that all microstates have equal probability. But of course, we have good evidence, direct evidence for the resurrection in this case, that a miracle was performed, and we have good reason to suppose that in this situation, God might perform a miracle. And so we cannot use the assumption that the laws of nature were operative, and so we cannot buy this probability postulate that Greg thinks comes from statistical mechanics. Obviously, the Christian is going to say that there was a miracle involved here, and so the normal probability postulates of statistical mechanics, given that they are contingent, doesn't go through. Greg said that the resurrection theory doesn't really do any good job of explaining things. And he talked about schmatums and atoms and said, the resurrection theory is fairly indeterminate. We have no idea what would follow from the resurrection theory. We don't know how Jesus would act if we don't know what he was made from. So what I'd say to this is really that we don't necessarily need to say in great detail what Jesus was made from. We often know the behavior of things without knowing what they're made of. Before modern physics and modern medical science, we had no idea what humans were made of. We had no idea that they were a mixture of cellular and extracellular material, that they were composed of atoms with electrons orbiting protons and neutrons. No, we had no reason to believe any of this about what physics and medicine tell us. But we, of course, knew how people would act. We could predict how they would act without knowing exactly what they were made from. So, if Cavan's thesis is correct, it seems that we couldn't explain anything done by humans before modern medicine. And perhaps not even then. Even with modern medicine, we don't know exactly what humans are made of. We don't know the most fundamental particles in particle physics. And yet we can generally predict how people will act, because this relies primarily on their psychological features rather than on their material constituents. So I think there are two plausible options for the resurrectionist here. One option is to say that the resurrected Jesus was made of atoms, but these atoms were acting abnormally. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It doesn't add anything extra onto the hypothesis because we already know that a miracle is involved. So we don't need to say that there was an additional miracle. The miracle is Jesus being raised from the dead miraculously. And so to say that he was acting miraculously doesn't seem to add anything to that hypothesis. Or we could just say that he was made of schmatums. We don't know what he was made of. But it's not clear by any means that this means we can't say what Jesus would do. So let me define the resurrection hypothesis as follows. I could say that the resurrection hypothesis is, in order to achieve certain aims which I've already spoken about, God raised Jesus to be with psychological and moral continuity in order to achieve God's aims. What that basically means is we don't need to say what the resurrection body was made of. We just need to say that the psychological features and the moral features of Jesus were roughly continuous between when he was alive, when he was dead, and when he was resurrected. And this generates most of the expectations we might have. So if Jesus was morally continuous, if he was psychologically continuous, if he was personally identical with the pre-death Jesus, we can predict what he would do. We can say that Jesus would probably leave a tomb empty. We would say that he would appear to people who would recognize him. He would appear to his disciples in recognizable forms so that they could believe what he said and spread his message. And so this doesn't seem to be a bad explanation at all. If we say that the risen Jesus was personally identical with the pre-death Jesus, regardless of what he was made of, we can make certain predictions about how he would act. So I don't think this is a very serious complaint. That's the end of that. And then Greg obviously had a few other objections to the resurrection thesis, which I'll just try to run through as quickly as possible. Though, as I said, I won't necessarily have time to respond to all of them. One of Greg's points is that the facts aren't proven by Bayes' theorem. So the facts I appealed to, that there was an empty tomb, that the disciples had appearances of Jesus, haven't been proven by Bayes' theorem. Now, obviously, I didn't formalize those facts in the technical machinery of Bayes' theorem, but the reasoning was roughly Bayesian. I said, for example, that if Jesus' tomb wasn't found empty, we would not expect these certain testimonial reports and so on. It's unlikely that we would have the testimonial reports in the biblical document if Jesus' tomb wasn't found empty. But if Jesus' tomb was found empty, we can easily explain why we have documents saying that Jesus' tomb was found empty. That's a more technical way of framing the argument. And all of my arguments can be put into the technical apparatus of Bayes' theorem and probability. I just didn't do so because it would have been too long and unnecessarily complex. But of course, everything I've said can be put into Bayes' theorem, and I think I gave sufficient evidence to establish those facts as facts. Greg then appealed to the principle of dwindling probabilities, which is something the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga talked about in one of his books a couple of decades ago now. And I think Greg is basically just misunderstanding here. So he says, I can't remember the exact way Greg put it, and there were a lot of slides to do with it, but even Alvin Plantinga himself, who originally came up with this principle of dwindling probabilities, has now rejected it. He said that the critiques of Timothy McGrew and other philosophers have basically shown that the principle is completely false. So even the original person who came up with this principle has admitted that it fails. Greg then talked a little bit about hell, obviously a very long and complex topic and one that I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about. But Greg seemed to be assuming here that the normal and the normative Christian view of hell is one of eternal torment. Now, of course, many Christians do believe in that view. They take the view of hell where hell is eternal torment. But actually, I think there is very good evidence from the biblical passages, from Jesus' teaching and from other scriptures in the New Testament, and from the Old Testament indeed, that actually hell, according to biblical norms and according to the correct biblical exegesis, doesn't entail anything like that. There is, of course, a lot of imagery, but the predominant theme in the Old Testament is that the wicked, when they were destroyed, would be completely annihilated. That's the end of their existence. And another overriding theme in the Bible is that people in general are not inherently immortal. Our souls aren't intrinsically immortal. Rather, God grants life to those who follow him or who are forgiven by him or who receive his grace. By default, humans are material things who die, and then we are raised by God if he so wants. And again, this seems to suggest that only if God wants to redeem people and have them in eternal bliss with him does he raise them from the dead. The New Testament is far from clear that hell is eternal torment. There's a very good book I'll just mention because I don't have much time to discuss it in detail. There's a book called Rethinking Hell, which is won the favour of a number of Christian theologians and biblical scholars, and there are lots of scholars contributing to it. And so mainstream evangelical theologians like John Stott, for example, have embraced this view called annihilationism, that hell actually just involves complete extinguishing from existence. And so Greg's complaints that God is awfully horrible for tormenting people eternally, I think, are misguided against, albeit a common notion of hell among Christians, but I don't think it's the right biblically correct one. So I don't think hell is going to be a useful objection. Greg talks a little bit about the idea of spiritual bodies in Paul. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, I talked about the 1 Corinthians 15 creed a little bit earlier, where Paul attests to the burial and various visions to Jesus' disciples and to the group of 500. A little bit later in that passage, Paul talks about the resurrection body. And he says that the resurrection will involve us having spiritual bodies rather than physical bodies. This is widely regarded as a mistranslation. I'm told, Greg brought a Greek Bible here. I probably won't even need to go into it. But the two terms used there are pneumatikos, which people have often translated as spiritual, and somatikos, which people have translated as physical. These Greek words don't actually mean those. So when Paul says that the resurrection body will be pneumatikos, spiritual, he means that it will be guided by the Holy Spirit, that it will be bearing the fruit of the Spirit as expounded later in his letter to the Galatians. And when he says somatikos, he doesn't mean physical. He doesn't say the resurrection won't be physical. He's saying it won't be natural. It won't be motivated and animated by the normal ways humans are animated. Normally, humans are animated by the love of money, by the love of other things that aren't very spiritual or aren't very pleasing to God. But Paul is talking about that here rather than about what the resurrection bodies will be made of. So actually, Paul's writing here completely fits with the previous tradition that resurrection would be a physical affair. And I think those translations of the Greek words are misguided here. Let me just find where else we go. One of my points was that Jesus was a special person. I said that Jesus is someone who God might want to vindicate by raising from the dead. He wasn't just an average person. God would have a special reason in the case of Jesus to raise him from the dead. And I said this for a variety of reasons, because he gave profound teaching. He taught that his life and death were reconciling humans to God, and so on. Greg took some objection to these points, but I think they're very important for understanding the context. There's no real reason, apart from the strong evidence, to think that God would raise Jesus if Jesus was just an average person. But if Jesus was someone who God specifically sent to perform a task that we might expect a good God to do, then it makes a lot of sense why God would want to raise Jesus. And I might just explain a little bit about how Jesus helped to achieve those tasks. So one of Greg's points was that teaching isn't needed. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by this. It was all gone through very quickly, and Greg simply asserted that teaching wasn't needed. Now, this seems to me plainly false. If anything, religious texts or religious traditions, or even God's communication himself, can, at least in principle, be one of the very best ways we have of learning about morality, of learning about the afterlife, and so on. So I simply don't understand Greg's assertion that teaching isn't needed, that teaching isn't a good reason for God to send Jesus as a prophet to teach us important things about the afterlife, about God, and about how we ought to live. So teaching seems to me a very good reason, and it seems to be one that Jesus fulfilled very well, given his profundity in his teaching, his wisdom and his clarity. Greg said we still suffer, so God sending Jesus to suffer with us doesn't really help the problem. To some extent this is true, but I never said that God sent Jesus simply to stop all suffering immediately. That's not what the Christians claim, so this is something of a straw man argument. Christians don't believe that God sent Jesus to immediately banish and prevent all future suffering. Christians say that God sent Jesus to identify with our suffering and to suffer with us. Let me use a little analogy just to make better sense of this. Sometimes parents, when they put their children through pain, will also go through pain to identify with them and to assure them that things are going to be okay. And sometimes it's justified for parents to put their children in pain. So, for example, when babies are vaccinated against infectious diseases, I've seen a lot of it as a medical student, starting as a doctor later this year. Plenty of parents put their kids through a lot of pain. Now, what they often do in this case is they identify with the child's pain. They will let the child squeeze their hand so that it hurts for them too. Or they will take a jab themselves to show the child that it's okay. There are lots of ways of parents enduring pain to help assure and comfort their children in their pain. even though the pain might be an important thing in the child's life for some reason. Now, I don't have time to explain the whole problem of evil and give a full theodicy today. That's simply not within the scope of what I'm saying. But I am saying that God's identifying with our suffering, his choosing to send himself as someone who can suffer in the same way with us and who can assure us that our suffering is not meaningless, constitutes a very good reason for God to send Jesus. And of course, as I explained earlier, there's very good evidence that Jesus fulfilled this role as well, that Jesus went through extreme suffering. He went through abandonment, loneliness, rejection by his closest friends, betrayal, and of course the extreme physical suffering involved in crucifixion itself. So, I grant that Jesus hasn't gotten rid of all suffering and he won't prevent it immediately. But I still think that this is a good reason for God to send Jesus, so that he can identify with his children and share in their suffering to show that it isn't meaningless suffering. How long do I have left now?
Time's up.
Time's up. Perfect. Okay. I'll try and respond to some of the rest after, but that's it for now. Thank you.
Well, I have more to show, but I better respond. So Greg rejects, I just want you to know, my argument was not frequentist. I reject frequentism. In fact, I made that very clear. Frequencies are crude, so to say I accept frequentism is simply to mischaracterize what I said. As far as statistical mechanics is concerned, I do have something I need to show you here. If I can get out of this. Cal made a very important point that I think needs to be dealt with, and that is this. He said statistical mechanics only works when something doesn't interfere. But statistical mechanics works as long as no energy is put in or out of the system. As long as the energy is constant, it works. God doesn't have energy. God cannot transfer energy into or out of the universe because God has no energy. So I think Callum's statistical mechanics counter-objection doesn't work. Callum says we don't have to know what Jesus is made of to know what he would do, but he skips the part where I said we wouldn't know what he would do anyway. I didn't say we had to know what Jesus is made out of to know what he would do. I would say, Paul says he's a spiritual body. Whatever you mean by this, we don't have any experience of spiritual bodies. We would not know what he's doing no matter what he's made out of. I want to point out that Callum has done the very thing I accused Christians of. He's tried to pad R into what I'll call R plus or R plus plus by adding the psychology and motivation of Jesus into that. But then that means that the denier of the resurrection is really denying R plus plus plus. And so he's really still, there's two kinds of deniers, one who believes in R and one who believes in not R. And he can't get away with that. He's equivocating again on what the resurrection means. Most importantly of all, Callum did not respond to my D argument. I proved that the resurrection theory has a low posterior probability by appealing to D. He's not said anything at all about that. Let's see what else. Dwindling probabilities, I think you missed my point. Yes, the McGrew showed that Flanagan was wrong in his use of dwindling probabilities or his criticism, but I'm not making the same point he's making. I'm just talking about biblical scholars and their use of dwindling probabilities. So I don't see your comment as being relevant to that. As far as why Jesus would be raised by God, what I meant by teaching isn't necessary is I don't need Jesus to tell me murder's wrong. I know it's wrong already. All the things that we know that are right or wrong, we know this apart from any kind of divine revelation. We don't need that. As far as Jesus identifying with our suffering, I've suffered anyway. The fact that Jesus identifies with my suffering, the fact that he suffered doesn't take away my suffering, nor does it make my suffering any less meaningless to me or meaningful. It has nothing to do with my suffering. So if that's God's plan, I would say that casts God into doubt. Why would he send Jesus for that purpose when it's not needed? Again, my point is not that we're suffering anyway. My point is we don't need meaning to our suffering, and Jesus going through suffering for no reason. Callum said a lot about hell and how hell is not eternal. He cited certain theologians like John Stott. I don't have time to do this, but I could go through all the passages with you, show you eternal suffering. I can show you the Greek. I can bring scholars in to say the opposite, so I'm not convinced by that. Again, I don't see any reason why God would have to use Jesus' resurrection to atone for our sins. in any way at all. How much time do I have?
You go about 11 minutes.
About 11 minutes. Well, then I can do a lot in 11 minutes. So I didn't get a chance to finish what I believe is the mythological nature of the Gospels, the legendary nature. So let's talk more about Gospels not being written by eyewitnesses. I think there's a better way to think about all this. The testimony of Papias, Irenaeus, John 21, which I didn't have a chance to talk about, and the problem, what's more probable? What's more probable? That unknown source, John the Elder, would make a mistake about authorship, or that a man would actually rise from the dead. Clearly, even on crude frequencies, it's much more probable that somebody would make a mistake than someone would rise from the dead. So I think we win there. What's more probable that someone, Irenaeus, writing 120 years after the events, would make a mistake, or that someone would rise from the dead? Callum said, by the way, he admitted he didn't use Bayesian arguments to get to his evidence. And he said he could, but the fact is he hasn't. I'm not going to accept that. You're going to have to before I accept your facts. Okay? You're going to have to give me a Bayesian argument for them. We have the unknown we of John 21. What's more likely? That they would be wrong, make a mistake? We don't even know who they are, right? Or that a man would rise from the dead? I think the answers to that are absolutely obvious. The four Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses. Okay, I talked about the problems about that already, so I will just say what's more probable. That all the Gospels are late non-eyewitness accounts, or that a man actually rose from the dead. If those are your options, it's clear that this is more probable. It's obvious. Only Paul provides eyewitness testimony. What about my point about a spiritual body? Callum went into soma pneumaticon. He got it wrong. It's actually soma psychikon, right? He says that doesn't really mean spiritual body and physical body. Well, there are scholars who say it does. So at this point, you're just going to have to take his word or my word for it. We don't have time to get into the exegesis of that. But what I would say is that if you read what Paul says, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, that certainly goes along with the idea of a spiritual body, not a physical body. Okay? Paul has limited information. We don't know where Paul got the 500 from, right? We don't know where he got this from. Some people think he got it from the church in Antioch. Some people think he got it from the church in Damascus. Some people think he got it from the church in Jerusalem. But the fact is, no one has given a good argument to show that Paul's source of this tradition, other than the last line, he appeared to me, is valid testimony, valid witnesses. So we don't know the source from where Paul received that tradition. There could be no appearance to the 12, which, by the way, Paul has, right? He appeared to the 12 because there was no 12. Judas was dead. So maybe was the 11th meant? 11, right? None of the Gospels talk about an appearance of the 500 plus. This will be a stupendous IMAX spectacular. It would bring the house down. And it would surely be recounted in the Gospels if it had occurred, and yet we don't have that in there. This raises a huge problem for that. None of the Gospels recount an appearance to all the apostles. None of the Gospels or Acts recount an appearance to James or Cephas. I'm not saying those didn't occur, but what I'm saying is we don't get that in the Gospels. So there's much more here. Callum is saying he can give a Bayesian argument. Well, I await your Bayesian argument, okay? I've given a Bayesian argument for D. You haven't responded to that. That's my main gripe, okay? Paul here seems to be using rabbinical technical terms, for I delivered what I also received, but I have a question. What's more probable? Did Paul mistakenly believe that he was passing on rabbinic tradition, or that a man rose from the dead? Clearly, that's more probable. 3 years later, after his conversion, Paul visited Cephas for 15 days, also saw James. Wouldn't you have gotten accurate information from them about what happened? You would certainly think so, right? We may presume, says C.H. Dodd, very famous statement of C.H. Dodd, that they did not spend their time talking about the weather. But wait a minute, what's more probable? That they did, quote unquote, just talk about the weather, in other words, other things, or that a man rose from the dead, okay? 14 years again later, Paul met with James and Cephas and John. Wouldn't he have checked his facts? But as we've seen, sometimes scholars, Christians, even the best ones, don't check their facts. And you get a whole legend forming, in this case about your Professor Catton, right? I never said the things that Timothy McGrew says. He didn't check his facts. And this thing is all over now because of YouTube. Just imagine if one gospel author doesn't check one fact out and then someone copies him. Before you know it, we have a whole legend forming. What's more probable? Paul didn't bother to check his facts and sources, assuming they were accurate, or that a man rose from the dead. Paul places all the appearances on a par with his own, right? He lists himself with the other witnesses. But the appearance to Paul was a vision of the ascended Jesus in the form of a bright light. Paul also had visions and revelations of Jesus when he was caught up in the third heaven, paradise, not knowing whether he was in or out of the body. This is 2 Corinthians 12. John, the seer, John of Patmos, was in the spirit. He saw Jesus whose eyes were like a flame of fire, faces like sun shining in full strength. This is what he saw, not the physical body that Callum's talking about. And Paul is in the same league, right? Paul states again that Jesus, the body of Jesus was transformed into an imperishable spiritual body. Physical bodies are perishable. They're made of atoms. They're made out of molecules. They're made out of quarks. You can take them apart, right? Physical bodies are not imperishable. Only some non-physical body is imperishable, and we don't know what kind of a body that is. We don't know what it would do. We don't know if they have the same memories. We don't know if they'd have the same behaviors. Yeah, you can pack it into R if you want to, but that doesn't really stop this. Okay? It is so in a physical body raised a spiritual body. If there's a physical body, there's a spiritual body, right? I didn't highlight this down here, but flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Okay? So it follows from this that the appearances to all the witnesses would have been visions of the ascended Jesus in the form of a heavenly body, at least, or maybe feelings of presence. So what I want to argue is that the original disciples, just like the Gospel Mark says, left. They fled before Jesus was buried. And I didn't get into the tomb yet. But they went around to see Jesus buried if he was. They fled immediately. That's what the Gospel Mark says. They went to Galilee, and there they waited for some months, and they finally saw some kind of vision of Jesus. I think they may have worked themselves into a trance state. I'm not going to say that's my theory, but I think that's likely. This is what they saw. They didn't see what the Bible says. We're dealing with mythology. So what's more probable? The appearances of the risen Jesus were originally heavenly visions seen in trance-like states, or some kind of a state like that, or that a man rose from the dead. Well, if I have to choose between the two hypotheses, this is clearly more probable, right? So it would seem to follow that the appearance stories of the Gospels are mere legends, okay? But let's look and see. So here's Timothy McGrew again, who got his facts wrong. I want you to see that Christians sometimes make mistakes. Even the top scholars don't check their facts. I want to show you now that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not check their facts. They got it wrong too. Jesus' body was sown a physical body, was raised a mortal, incorruptible, spiritual body. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Have the Gospel of Luke. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bone. You have a flat contradiction and a change over a 30-year period. Early witness, 54 to 55. Late witness, 85. You have a complete about-face in those 30 years. Now, Timothy McGrew tries to explain away the contradiction of the Bibles in the Gospels by saying they're incomplete and complementary. Luke was not an eyewitness source. He gave priority to material not found in Mark. The evangelists ran out of room because their scrolls were too short. And interpreters are careless, conflate and ignore context. We don't know why, is his final reason. He bases his approach on a discredited book, The Life of Christ in Stereo. He doesn't use the book, but he's using the same approach of harmonization. Let's take up each of these one by one. Are the Gospels incomplete? Well, let's look at what Luke says. Luke in Acts says, in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up. Everything. He says it in Luke as well. But the funny thing is, Luke does not include the appearances in Galilee. He only has appearances in Jerusalem, and yet he claims to have dealt with all. So if you take him at his word, then he's saying there were no appearances in Galilee at all. So you can see the Gospels do not claim to be incomplete and complementary. Acts claims to be complete. What about interpreters who are careless and conflate and ignore context? Well, if you look very clear from the context, Luke knows all about the appearances in Galilee. He's read Mark, he's read Matthew, he knows what's going on. He doesn't want appearances in Galilee, he wants them all to be in Jerusalem, and so he simply cuts these out. It's very telling. He cuts out Jesus' statement on the Mount of Olives, after I'm raised up, I'll go before to Galilee. You see, if Luke had that in there, he could not have appearances in Jerusalem only. So the interpreters are not being careless. They're not completely ignoring context. What about Luke was not an eyewitness, relied on sources? Well, if that's true, let me ask you this. If Luke relied on sources, was not an eyewitness, why, if he gives priority to material not found in Mark, why would he omit Matthew's baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? It is commanded by Jesus in Matthew, and yet Luke cuts this out. One of the most important passages. Okay? The evangelist ran out of space. Are you kidding? This is a reason why I should not see contradictions, and we don't know why this is a reason. Right? That's laughable. So I did a little experiment. How much time do I have?
We're out of time.
Oh, ooh, okay. Well, then Callum, it's your turn.
Thanks again, Greg. As we saw last time, I didn't have time to get through everything. Again, that would probably be the case here, but I'll do my best to just run through some of the objections Greg gave to my case. And obviously, I will apologize for not being entirely comprehensive. Greg's first point was that he isn't a frequentist anyway, and that he concedes that these frequentist arguments are bad ones. So I agree with him on that, and congratulate him for accepting my point there. The second is that God cannot transfer energy, is the second point he gives. And he says the probability laws of statistical mechanics work as long as you accept this. But again, if transferring energy is what's needed for a miracle, God is omnipotent. God is capable of at least transferring energy. According to Christians, God created the whole world and created all of energy in the entire world. So it's not too beyond his remit or beyond his power to be able to transfer energy with the world. And so I don't think we can really take that as a serious objection to the idea of God performing a miracle. His third argument is that we have no experience of spiritual bodies. I tried to deal with this before. Granted, we may not have experience of resurrection bodies, but we do have experience of persons. We know that persons, on the whole, tend to be fairly psychologically stable, especially extra good ones, particularly good, ethical, stable ones are often ethically continuous. And so it's not unreasonable to suppose that a good person, forget the body, we're saying that the person Jesus rose from the dead with whatever body. And we have experience of persons, particularly of good persons. We know what good persons are likely to do. And in the case of Jesus, I've already argued that it would be a good thing for Jesus to rise from the dead to vindicate his ministry. Fourth, Greg says we don't need teaching. We already know that some things, immorality, are wrong. Or we know that murder is wrong, for example. I grant that we might know this. But there are plenty of more detailed points about which we might not know without religious inspiration. We might not know, for example, that praying is a good thing to do. We might not know other particular religious commands or things that God wants or things that God says are better for other humans. And notice I didn't only talk about moral knowledge. I talked about knowledge about the afterlife, about God himself. These would also be perfectly adequate reasons for God to reveal himself and to provide teaching other than moral knowledge. I do also have another argument that moral knowledge doesn't quite fit on atheism. I don't have time to give that here. But Greg's assertion that we already have knowledge without any need for religion or for God is dubious. And I just point you to literature doubting this claim. Greg talks a lot about Bayesian arguments and the fact that I didn't give Bayesian arguments for the empty tomb and for the appearances to disciples in my opening speech. I grant this, but I think one of the best things about Bayes' theorem is that you can do it yourself. I have already given, if we find an example of Bayes' theorem, here we go. I've given an example in my last speech of how we can put the facts I mentioned into this sort of equation. So, if we say R is instead the hypothesis now, I said, for example, that it would be incredibly unlikely, if the tomb wasn't found empty, it would be incredibly unlikely that we would have multiple independent accounts testifying to it. So that means that this factor is low. The probability of the evidence, the testimonial account, given that we reject the theory, given that the tomb wasn't empty, is very improbable. But if the tomb was empty, it's probable we would have these testimonial accounts. So this factor is large, and so multiplying it by the prior probability of the empty tomb means that we have a higher probability of the empty tomb than we did before. I obviously don't have time to go through my entire opening speech again and again, basing it up, but I'm sure people who are mathematically acquainted with it, and especially Greg, who is well acquainted with Bayes' theorem itself, are capable of putting these arguments into technical terms. So I don't think that will really constitute a serious objection to my case. I should apologise here for the next point. Greg says that I got the word for physical wrong. I did indeed. So I was confusing soma, which is the Greek for body, and psychikon, which Greg rightly points out is the Greek word translated natural or physical in some translations of the New Testament. But my point is still clear, that verbs ending in ikos or ikon in the Greek tend to refer to the thing that's animating a body rather than referring to things that a body is materially constituted by. And so many scholars have made this point. For example, N.T. Wright, in many recent works, has gone into extreme detail on this point, pointing out that ikon or ikos verbs refer to what animates a thing rather than what a thing is made out of. And so my point about psychikon bodies being bodies animated by the natural instincts and desires of humans is still correct. And so I don't think Greg has really adequately responded to that point, though I thank him for pointing out my error earlier on. Greg also talks about the flesh and blood and flesh and bones. So Luke talks about Jesus being flesh and bones, whereas Paul says that the flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. What Greg is missing here is that flesh and blood is a Semitic idiom, specifically referring to perishability or mortality. Flesh and blood isn't, in Paul's case, intended to refer literally to the resurrection body being made out of similar things to you and me. He wasn't saying it's non-physical. He's saying it's not perishable, because flesh and blood is specifically a Semitic idiom indicating that. And so that's completely consistent with Luke saying, or Luke having Jesus say that Jesus was indeed flesh and bones, and that it was a largely physical resurrection. Greg talks about what is more probable a lot of the time. And so we've seen a lot of scales saying what's more probable. Paul made this mistake, or Papias made this mistake about the authorship of Matthew, for example, or a man rising from the dead. Now, obviously, I would agree. I'm not insane. Many people have said I am for reasons unrelated to this, but I am not insane enough to think that the simple facts, a man rising from the dead, is more probable than Eusebius making a mistake about Papias or something like that. In isolation, any given man raising from the dead is improbable, and Papias is making a mistake about the authorship of Matthew is moderately probable. But this kind of it doesn't quite understand my argument. I did not say that these facts on their own were exceptionally improbable or exceptionally probable. I didn't even refer to the fact that of traditional authorship for the Gospels. I never staked my case on the fact that Matthew's Gospel was written by the disciple Matthew or Levi, anything like that. I didn't make these claims. I referred to very specific claims, well evidenced, independently attested, including embarrassing details, including incidental details, all these things which we would not expect if the accounts were not roughly accurate. And I said the conjunction of all the facts that I inferred from this, that Peter came to believe in Christ's resurrection and so on, that the tomb was found empty, that James, the brother of Jesus, came to believe in Jesus' resurrection. I said the conjunction of all these facts that I've given the evidence for again and again is exceptionally improbable if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So that's one of the probabilities that we have on the scales. On the other side, Greg says a man rising from the dead is improbable. Of course, I accept this. And even Jesus rising from the dead, I think, is moderately improbable unless we have the direct evidence. But, as I have pointed out, we have this overwhelmingly strong evidence, this evidence of these conjunction of facts. And I've said that this conjunction of facts would be extremely improbable if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. I've also pointed to how God has reason to raise Jesus from the dead, some of which Greg has misunderstood in my speeches. And so, all in all, I don't think the scales weigh up anything like what Greg will have you believe. Greg says that it's more probable that Papias makes one error than that a man rises from the dead. I'm not disputing that claim at all, and I would urge you to realize that. I have said that the conjunction of all these things is very improbable, but God has a good reason, if he exists, to raise Jesus from the dead. And so I don't think we can say that that is improbable without much better reason than Greg's given. Finally, I'll just say a little bit about contradictions and discrepancies. I think if we were really to take an inerrantist or an extreme view of the Bible, which some of my fellow Christians do, I think we might run into problems. I will grant that. My case, I urge you to realize, is not staked on the claim of biblical inerrancy or on the fact that the Gospels cannot contain contradictions or anything like that. It's perfectly possible that some of them do. And I think, given the evidence, some of the Gospels do contain discrepancies and inconsistencies. So I will grant that. But I don't think that does anywhere near as much damage to historical inquiry as Greg seems to suggest it does. So, for example, we have many other cases in history where there have been discrepancies between multiple accounts, and yet historians recognize a common core to those. So, for example, Florus's account of the number of troops at Pharsalia differs from Caesar's own account by 150,000 men, but no one doubts that this battle took place and that there were large numbers of men involved. According to Josephus, the embassy of the Jews to the Emperor Claudius took place in seed time, but Philo says it was in the harvest time, but no one doubts that this took place. And these examples could be multiplied. I'm grateful for Tim McGrew, who's been mentioned a few times, for these examples. But you can see that no historians doubt these common cores. Any historical event where historians have written about it from different angles will differ on incidental details. And that's what we have in the accounts in the Bible. But nothing has gone to undermine the fundamental core behind these. The disciples appeared to Jesus, the tomb was found empty, or that there was a big battle at Pharsalia. So I don't think Greg's pointing to small discrepancies in details will really do much to undermine the case. If anything, he has just given us further evidence that the Gospels do not collude together to provide a completely unifying, satisfactory account. The Gospels do have discrepancies in different parts. That is very good evidence that they have at least some independence from each other, and that the common historical core to which I'm referring has independent attestation from a variety of sources. How much time do I have?
You got maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
2 or 3 minutes, okay. In that case, let me quickly talk about the issue of atonement, which Greg has said we don't need Jesus to come here to make atonement. And I think Christians have often said that God needs to kill someone to make atonement, and that rightly seems very odd to us and unnatural, and I don't think we should just accept it on a plain reading, on the face of it. But it does seem plausible to me that God might use someone, he might come to earth to make atonement with us. Atonement just means reconciliation. Two friends becoming friends together again after a period of falling out or something similar. And it does seem to me that God can at least go some way towards that by becoming human himself, by identifying with our suffering. And one way he does this is by showing how much we mean to God. So one theory of the atonement has been what's called a ransom theory. There have been caricatured versions of this, including devils and so on. I won't go into that. I don't think that's plausible. But one way Jesus' death might make atonement with us is by showing just how much we mean to God, and thereby inviting us to be in relationship with him because we know that God values us. So, for example, if God simply told us, I really like you, I think humans are nice, and I want to be reconciled to you, that wouldn't be a very plausible example. But if God became human himself and went through this extreme suffering, the abandonment, the loneliness, the betrayal, and the excruciating physical agony of crucifixion, this goes at least some way towards showing us how worthy and valuable we are to God. And establishing how worthy and valuable we are to God goes a very long way in reconciling that relationship. Many people have felt that God doesn't love them because of suffering, because of evil things like that. And so God showing us our worth by going to the cross and being humiliated in that way, I think goes some way towards establishing that. There are many other theories of atonement, which I don't have much time to go into, but that's at least one of the ways, and it can at least help us to see why God might want to become human to help make atonement with him. And I just really quickly want to point to how this works probabilistically. There we go. Okay, so you might be thrown off by saying, well, even if God would want to become human and want to make atonement with us and share in our suffering and teach us truths about morality, the afterlife, and about God himself, it's not really probable that God would do that if he existed. But that misunderstands the point of Bayes' theorem. Any given explanation to have evidence in favor of it does not need to predict the observation in precise detail. It merely needs to predict the observation more than the observation would be predicted if the theory wasn't true. So, for example, if the probability of the evidence given the theory is 0.001, some people would think, well, that means the evidence doesn't support the theory. That, if the theory can only predict the evidence to that extent, it's not a very good theory. But what Bayes' theorem tells us probabilistically is that as long as this value is higher than the probability of the evidence otherwise, then actually the evidence can confirm the theory considerably. So I don't need to say that without a doubt God would become incarnate and send Jesus and do all these things to make atonement with us. I don't need to say that the probability of God doing that is 1 because it's just so certain. I need to point to how it's plausible. And I want to say that given the reasons I've offered, it's at least moderately probable that God would want to do something like that with Jesus. And if that's the case, then the prior probability of the resurrection is at least moderate. And so I think this also goes some way to showing that Greg's arguments that the prior probability are not quite good enough. I think that we can establish at least a moderate prior probability using these considerations about what God would be likely to do and what Jesus did in fact do in his ministry. I apologize if that's all very complex, but that's part of the argument, and I want to at least acquaint you with some of the ideas behind what God is doing according to Christians. And if we have that moderate prior probability, then, as I've argued, the evidence is easily capable of overcoming that moderate improbability. Like I said, a lot to get through. I still haven't been able to get anywhere near through everything that Greg has said, but I hope I've done my best, and I'm happy to hand back over to him now. So thank you very much.
Well, how much time do I have?
It's almost 4. How much time do you guys want to take?
You can have as much time as I have.
All right, you got 15 minutes, and I got to go.
Okay.
I got to
Well, then, maybe that'll be it. Okay. Calvin still has not answered my big objection, which is this. The prior probability of D is much, much greater than the prior probability of not D, and the explanatory power of D is approximately that of the explanatory power of not D. And so it follows from this immediately that the posterior probability of D on the evidence is much, much greater than 1/2. I mean, I would say it would probably be 0.999 easily. And it follows from that immediately that the probability of R on the evidence is extremely low. Okay? He hasn't answered that. And that's the main thing I'm waiting to hear from him, because I think that's the main argument. Let me answer his objections very quickly. He said God can transfer energy. From what? The universe is all the energy there is. God has no energy. He can't transfer energy. He can transfer energy within the universe, but that's not going to help us here, right? I say we have no experience of spiritual bodies. He says we have experience of persons, but that's not the point. There are two kinds. Persons with spiritual bodies, persons without. You cannot just say, oh, we've seen persons without spiritual bodies, therefore we know what persons we've seen persons with physical bodies, therefore we know what persons with spiritual bodies will do. There are two different things. He has no reason to generalize from physical bodies to spiritual bodies. Again, I say my point would be that R is undefined. It's only partially defined. Only partially. It's not defined enough to be able to figure out what Jesus would do. We don't know whether he would have the same memories, whether he'd have the same personality, the same traits. We don't know that. That's enough to keep R from giving even a moderate explanatory power to E. Let me see. Again, Callum spent a lot of time on why God would raise Jesus. Teaching, again, I would say we don't need that kind of teaching. We know to pray anyway if we believe in God. If we don't believe in God, we don't need to know whether to pray. I don't think we need that. Again, I don't think Jesus identifying with us and the fact that he came and suffered in any way at all helps us with our suffering, right? The fact that you suffer, other people suffer, doesn't help me in my suffering. Again, oh, by the way, sukikon and pneumaticon are not verbs, they are adjectives. So I'm not sure what his point there was, but he's grammatically incorrect. Let me move on to just a couple of points I want to make. We didn't quite finish everything I want to talk about. I want to talk about a tale of three hypotheses, if I can get this thing to open up. I'm going to give you a literary hypothesis that the purpose of Matthew's gospel is to supply the appearance to the disciples in Galilee that's promised in but missing from Mark. I make 5 predictions on this hypothesis. I can predict that Matthew will keep Jesus saying on the Mount of Olives, I will go before you to Galilee, which you find in Matthew. So if I never read Matthew and all I knew was that Matthew's purpose in writing beat Mark's lost ending, if that's all I knew, and I'd read Mark, I could predict that I would find this in Matthew, and lo and behold, you find it in Matthew. I could predict that what the angels say would be changed, and that in particular, the fear of the women would be omitted from Matthew, and lo and behold, it is. I can predict that without even having read Matthew. I can predict, not with 100% probability, but with moderate probability, that there will be an appearance, a very short, very brief appearance to Jesus to do one thing only. Get those disciples over to Galilee, because that's all he does. He meets them, he says, hail, they touch his feet, they worship him, and he says, tell them to go to Galilee. I can predict that. And I can predict that at the end there will be an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee. So on the literary hypothesis, I can predict this. But on the hypothesis that Callum is giving us, we can't. Right? We cannot make these kind of predictions. What about Luke? On the literary hypothesis that Luke's purpose is to place all the appearances in and near Jerusalem, we can predict a lot. We can predict that Jesus' statement to the disciples on the Mount of Olives will not occur in Luke, and behold, it's not there. If I had never read Luke, but I knew what his purpose was, I could make this prediction, and this prediction comes out to be true. I can predict that the words of the angels, go to Galilee, tell them to go to Galilee, there you will see him, would have to be changed, and they are. I can predict that there would be appearances to all the big names in Jerusalem. I can predict that Jesus would say, let me zoom in on that so you can read it, would say, do not depart from the city, stay here. And that's exactly what you find in Luke. And I can predict we'd have some kind of ascensions as well. I can also predict that John would take bits and pieces of these, because John is the last gospel, and put them together. So I actually came up with a Bayesian argument for this, just for this debate. So this has never been seen by anyone before, including me. So let me see if I can find it. Right here. So here I have a bunch of facts, okay, that Matthew has something, he lacks something, he has something, lacks something. These are traditions. And then here's Luke lacking them and having them. So I came up with a list of 18 so far. This is just, I just threw this together last night, so forgive me. And then I put the thing together with Bayes' theorem. And I make an assumption here. I assume that my literary hypothesis has a prior probability of only 0.1. I give the other hypothesis, which I'm calling H for the harmony hypothesis, a prior probability of 0.9. I'm giving them 9 times more advantage than I'm giving my hypothesis. Now, I computed this with just 14 facts, not 18. And when I did the Bayesian calculation, the probability that we have literary hypothesis, that it's not historical facts, Luke and Matthew have simply changed things the way they want to, given their purposes, is 0.99945. Now, I'm not giving this as a real Bayesian argument. I'm giving this just as a first draft of what you can do. I called Colin Betty on the phone last night. He said, let's not use 2 times, let's use 1.1 times. Okay, let's do that. You still get a final probability of 0.8. So what I want to argue here is that we don't just have discrepancies. We have purposive changes by the later gospel authors to earlier gospel authors because they have different things they want to do. We're not dealing with history, we're dealing with fabrication, utter fabrication. So again, what's more probable? That these stories are almost entirely legendary or that a man rose from the dead? So what I want to argue is the facts that Callum did not give a Bayesian argument for are not really facts at all. Failure to check sources leads to legends, right? Here you have an original appearance to the disciples in Galilee 6 months later, right? I have seen the risen Jesus, they say later on in Jerusalem. Someone overhears them and thinks they're talking about a physical body in Jerusalem, right? That then is heard by someone else and thinks, oh, the appearance occurred in Jerusalem, not in Galilee. And before you know it, we have Luke, and now we have all these copies and all these other books perpetuating the idea of appearances in Jerusalem, not Galilee. So I want to argue, you can give a Bayesian argument for this. I've given you a proto-Bayesian argument for it. So I just don't think the evidence is good the way Callum has to say. So the alleged evidence isn't really evidence at all. Now let's take all my doubts so far and pile them all on top of this side of the scale. Before I was dealing with individuals, let's put them all together, and others I couldn't fit into this diagram because I got, these got too small. I couldn't do it. Or a man rose from the dead. Clearly, this is more probable that you would get all these things by even just pure coincidence. Again, I do not have any sympathy for Callum's argument that God would make an exception at the prior probability of the resurrection is even moderately high. I just don't think he's made that case at all. So then what is the actual evidence? I would argue we have non-eyewitness traditions of the death and burial of Jesus. We have non-eyewitness narratives of the death, burial, and the empty tomb story. We have Paul's eyewitness report that Jesus appeared to him, spiritual body, vision, right? Blinding vision. We have Paul's placing his appearance to himself on a par with the other appearances. This is the only eyewitness we have using spiritual body, flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom of God. By the way, I know that's an idiom. However, it is clear in context. Paul's not using that in the normal idiomatic way. He has more to say there than that. We have the non-eyewitness traditions of the rest of 1 Corinthians, right? We don't know where Paul got his information. So then, I think the resurrection theory is refuted by the bona fide evidence, which I just covered. The most we can say about the appearances, I think with any degree of confidence, is the disciples did not flee. They left because Jesus told them to go to Galilee. So they went to Galilee. They weren't fleeing. All that negative way the Gospels, Mark portrays the disciples, Mark has been known since the work of Wilhelm Wrede in 1901, the messianic secret of the Gospels, to portray the disciples in the most negative way. They come off as the most stupid idiots in Mark on purpose. He wants to make them negative. The reason why we have women appearing at the tomb is because the disciples have fled in Mark. All that's simply Mark making the disciples look bad. He has a reason to make them look bad. He doesn't see this as an embarrassment. He sees this as a good thing because he's putting them up as a role model for the later church to see what not to do. Don't be like these guys, be the opposite of them. Look how bad they were, right? So Mark has no problem with that. So they went to Galilee as Jesus directed them. They waited around, began feeling his presence. Crossan says this, you cited Crossan. And then in certain cases had visions induced maybe by trance-like states of the ascended Jesus in heaven, much like the vision had by Paul years later and by John, the seer John. This gave rise to the belief that the corpse of Jesus had been transformed into a spiritual body. All this fits the data perfectly. And then finally, what about the tomb? The corpse of Jesus not left on the cross. If it was not left on the cross, by the way, Crossan says it was. So you cited Crossan. You can't cite him for one thing and not for another, okay? So Crossan says the corpse of Jesus was left on the cross. That was the typical Roman procedure. I grant all the evidence you brought up otherwise, though. I think this is a contentious issue. So I'm not going to say it wasn't buried. But I think if it was buried temporarily in a tomb for criminals outside of Jerusalem, then removed. McCain and Lauder argue this. We lack information about what happened after that, since the disciples and women were now in Galilee. They went around to see where the tomb was. They don't know. By the time they got back to Jerusalem 6 months later, the corpse would have decomposed, not completely, but enough, within 6 months, it would be unrecognizable. And so there was no way of knowing the body of Jesus was still there. And of course, they'd had the vision, so they'd already seen Jesus, and so they thought he was risen anyway. Okay? So, I will end at that point. I don't know if the technical people want to do this, but if you want to hang around, we can have a conversation now if you want, back and forth, or we can end it. What is your pleasure, ladies and gentlemen? And what is your pleasure, Callum?
I'm happy to talk to people in person or at the front or whatever. I'm happy to talk to people in person or at the front or whatever.
So you want us to continue, or do you want to end it? Okay. Why don't you come on up and we'll take questions.
It's more likely to believe that what the disciples, okay, basically you said that because it was women who were presenting this information.
Grew got, but I've never made that stipulation except in one debate. That was Michael Kona, and that's only because I wanted to talk about the absurdities of the twin theory itself. That was why I made the stipulation. I want you to know I can't claim credit for the twin theory. It actually comes from Dr. Paul Meyer, a historian at Western Michigan University, in a book he wrote in 1973 called The First Easter. He himself does not advocate that theory, but he came up with it. I read about it, and so I worked it into my dissertation, my debate with Craig. He said, and I quote Meyer, "Of all the wild theories, that's the only one that would make a modicum of sense to me." Well, I think he's right in a way, except I don't think the twin theory is as wild as the resurrection theory. I think the theory that Jesus had an identical twin is absurd, but I think it's still much, much less absurd than the resurrection theory itself. I won my debate with Craig, I would say, by making that point. My point was, the most important point was, if you accept all the evidence that Callum's going to present tonight, then you're going to have to accept the twin theory, okay? I also want you to know, we invited William Lane Craig and Michael Licona to this debate with no stipulations of any kind at all. Both declined, and Callum accepted. So I just want you to know that fact. Then, if anyone should believe the twin theory, it should be Timothy McGrew, because he's the one who believes the disciples had polymodal, interactive, parallel sensory experiences of the risen Jesus. And I will argue that if Callum believes that too, he too should believe in the twin theory, right? I will be pleased to debate the twin theory with Timothy McGrew anytime you'd like, open invitation. I'd be happy to debate hallucinations, space aliens, ghosts, anything else absurd you can think of, okay? What I'd really like to debate McGrew on is the myth-legend theory. I'd like to show him that it's more probable the Bible is myth and legend than it is that Jesus rose from the dead. What I want you to see here is even top Christian scholars don't bother to check the facts. Timothy McGrew didn't. So what I said back in 2012 was I didn't want to debate the twin theory with Michael Licona only. Some unknown source told Timothy McGrew that I said I never wanted to debate it again. McGrew put that on his videotape, and now this has gone around the whole world. So what I want you to see is Christians don't check their facts. And when you don't check your facts, you get legends. And I'm going to be showing you today exactly how we get legends with the Bible. Okay? So, one last thing. My debate will differ from my other two debates. This time, I'm going to be showing the prior probability of the resurrection is low. I'm going to be showing that the resurrection lacks power to explain the evidence that Callum's going to present. I'll show that the evidence is not really evidence at all. It's myth and legend. And then I will give an Bayesian argument for a version of the legend theory. Okay, so yours.
Let's check this works. Great. Okay, so this will be my opening speech now, so I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. I hope you don't get too bored, but I'll dig right in so that we minimize the chances of that. I'm going to begin with a story. So the year is around 4 BC. A small, rowdy, but unimportant corner of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is lord over Rome, most of northern Africa, the Mediterranean, Europe, and Israel. It's an unhappy arrangement. Most Jews begrudgingly submit to their de facto king, while others violently resist. In a small countryside of shepherds, fishermen and outcasts, a baby is born. He grows up modestly, submitting to his parents and working as a manual labourer in a nearby town. 30 years pass, and he might well have lived and died with no one ever knowing. But one day things change. This nobody finds a few other nobodies fishing, and they join him. He performs miracles, not to the important people or to kings, but to peasants. Not to win acclamation, but to heal and to serve. There are no megachurches, no flashing lights, and no #1 Yeezy album. He reaches out to oppressed women, to untouchables, and to other outcasts, healing them and inviting them to join his kingdom. To join not for material gain, but for friendship with himself, the king. And this is a king who bends to wash the feet of his subjects and humiliates himself so that the last, the least, and the lost can be honoured. And so important people from the city begin to hear things about him. They ask, who is this king? Who is this person who thinks they can change law and who can call themselves king? Who is it who touches the unclean in this way? And so they go to him, they test him, and they say, who is the king? Do we pay taxes to the king Caesar? If he says yes, then he gets killed by the Jews, and if he says no, he gets killed by the Romans. So Jesus asks whose image the coin they're talking about bears. They tell him it bears Caesar's image. And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The coin bears Caesar's image, but you bear God's image. Caesar can have his coin, but I want you who hate me and try to kill me. And so his disciples later protest, Lord, call down fire on them. And Jesus' best friend even goes to kill one of his arresters, but Jesus rebukes him and heals the man. Love your enemies, he tells them, real enemies, those who arrest you and try to crucify you. And as Jesus claims kingship and divine authority, as he judges the important religious people for hating their enemies and outcasts, they kill him. They give him a death so excruciating and lonely that Roman citizens were exempt from it. A death so shameful that Hebrew law regarded the crucified as accursed by God. And so the movement was dead. The wannabe king died as he was born, a lonely, rejected loser from Nazareth. But a few days later, something interesting happened. Those who followed him and abandoned him began to preach that he was alive and that he was king. Those who had rejected him all along began to say the same thing. This band of losers from the Galilean countryside travelled across Europe, Asia, and Africa, declaring that this crucified criminal and blaspheming peasant had been raised from the dead. People from the lakes of Galilee and from the high council in Jerusalem began to throw their lives down for him. They shared any riches they had with the poor, prayed for their enemies, were thrown into prison and killed with stones and crosses, so that a few decades later, bishops in France were writing, "Come fire and cross, come hacking off of limbs, come crushing of my whole body, and come the cruel tortures of the devil. Only let me reach Jesus Christ." And the invitation they had was this: come to join this kingdom with a king who sits not on lofty thrones, but nailed to a cross by his own subjects. A kingdom that prevails against the corrupt, greedy, and violent kingdoms and states of this world. A kingdom that endures against suffering and even against death itself. A kingdom that offers such freedom that those who join it endure in it against all afflictions, and such freedom that comes from friendship with the king himself. A freedom from the shackles of shame or guilt, from the need for popularity, from the longing for reputation or acceptance, and from any other secret addiction to money, sex, or whatever else we long for and beat ourselves up over. And so this is a real challenge. The king of the kingdom tells me that I must love my enemies and forgive those who wrong me. He tells me that if I don't have time for the most unimportant, lowest person I come across, then I don't have time for the king of the world himself. That's the kind of radical acceptance he asks for. But following this crucified servant king is a challenge that many from the very start have accepted, and with it, changed the world. And so the question now is, how did this all happen? What led this band of outcasts, council members, and Romans to go willingly to their deaths in the name of a public embarrassment, Jesus? I'm going to be arguing that the evidence we have strongly suggests that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his ministry and start a movement following him. So let me split the evidence into two. Firstly, we have what I'll call direct evidence for the resurrection. This includes all the evidence we have about Jesus' death and burial and the beginning of early Christianity and what the disciples claimed about him having an empty tomb and appearing to them. Then we have a variety of indirect evidence. The most important for today's discussion are the top two, the evidence of Jesus' ministry and the evidence of Jesus' character. But I want to at least note that there is other evidence that I won't have time to talk about. So let me turn to the first piece of direct evidence relevant to the case at hand, the death of Jesus by crucifixion. This fact is so uncontested in historical scholarship that even the liberal scholar John Dominic Crossan writes, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Historians have a staggering amount of source material for this event. Not only is Jesus' death...
He gave me a thumbs up when you guys I don't know where's my guy.
Just want you to know that. Social
Or they're so desensitized with video because nobody else is very it's not
And here's what we're going to do.
Do you want to erase? You want me to erase
Johnson wants to do it. And at that point, just maybe sit down. Stare at us and wait a second.
So just go like this.
Flip this off for a second.
Check.
So let me. Are we all set to go? Set? Okay. We're all set.
Okay then. Hello everyone, I'm Mark Anderson. I'll be the moderator to this debate. I'd like to introduce Professor Caven and Mr. Miller here. They will be going over whether Jesus' resurrection is a fact or a myth, and I will let them introduce themselves. Starting with Professor Caven.
Well, first we're going to do 5 minutes on base theory.
Oh, 5 minutes here. Okay, well.
We're going to force you to learn something. So, you can start.
Okay.
I'm going to raise this, and Susan will pull me.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for coming out and for listening to me and Greg talk about this issue. I assume that most of you will be fairly interested in it. I did notice that this thing about Cyprus Sex Day was on the board, so if you're coming for that, that's the wrong thing, and you should leave now. But we're going to be talking about something much more...
Anything in here for H besides the resurrection. So that's one form. Then to complicate it even more for you, If you don't have just two hypotheses, but you have a whole bunch, so let H be the resurrection hypothesis, these might be all the alternatives to it, such as the swoon theory, mass hallucination theory, the theft of the body in the tomb theory, the twin theory, things like that, then these would fit into here. So there are more complicated versions, but we're not going to get too. Okay. We're out of time. Okay. So now you have your 5-minute introduction.
Thanks. So the important thing to remember and keep in mind is that the probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is a combination of two factors. It will be how well the resurrection explains the evidence compared to how well alternative theories explain the evidence. And then the other factor is the prior probability. And that's what we mean by prior probability. How likely is it that the resurrection would happen before looking at the evidence? And so those are the really main important things that we'll need to keep in mind. And as long as you've roughly got the gist of that, then we should be able to keep up. So, about me. You will notice that this slide is completely empty. I assure you that I'm slightly more interesting than this, but not a huge amount. So Greg has given me 5 minutes to introduce myself. It probably won't take that long. There's not a huge amount to say. But I'm Callum Miller. I was born in London in the UK and grew up there, as most people do, before going to university. And I went to the University of Oxford to study there. And I'm still there, so I've started a 6-year course in medicine, which I'm just finishing up this year. So when I go back to the UK in August, I'll start work as a doctor. But I also have quite an interest in philosophy and theology and things like this, the application of probability to miracles and to the resurrection. And so I'm very interested in these kinds of questions as well. So I've published a couple of papers in the philosophy of religion as well, to try and keep my interest up in it. There's not too much else to say. I'm also a fairly normal guy. I like things like football and music and dancing, anything that other people enjoy doing. So I'm not kind of a purely academic kind of person, as much as I might give that impression sometimes. But that's just a little bit about me. So the last real thing is just to thank people, both the audience and everyone here for turning out, for Aaron Schellenberger at Charlotte, Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, for suggesting this debate and putting it on. Thank you to Cyprus for hosting me and to Greg for agreeing to debate. And like I say, thank you to everyone for being here. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm willing, and I assume Greg is willing, to stay around afterwards if you want to continue talking about these things or if there's something you didn't understand. Greg's nodding at me now, so I assume we'll both be around afterwards if you want to follow up with questions or come and speak to us. Do feel very welcome. But that's pretty much everything I want to say about myself, so I'll hand over to Greg again now.
We're going to be switching back and forth between his and mine. So this is for Aaron. Aaron, if you're out there watching, I just want you to know this is for you. Okay? You asked it, you got it. I had planned in my background to talk about my far background, but I found something very disturbing when I was preparing for this debate on the internet. Timothy McGrew, who's a major player in the resurrection, has a video, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, which he gave on April 9th, 2012 at a church, and I have all the information here. He says, Robert Greg Cavan was fond of promoting the twin theory and actually tried this in a debate with my good friend Bill Craig, which I did back in 1995, and got destroyed so humiliatingly that I am told he is willing to debate about the resurrection, but he doesn't use that theory, and he stipulates it as a condition of his going into the debate that he not be mentioned. He doesn't want to be reminded that he was once an advocate of this theory. Well, here's what I want you to know. This is a myth. It's completely false. I never said that. Never said anything like that. Callum, I had no condition with you that we not talk about the twin theory, correct? Yes. So I just want you to know, this is, I don't know what the source is that...
exciting than sex, which is Bayes' theorem.
Much more.
I can assure you. And applying it to Jesus' resurrection. So we thought we'd at the start talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem and how to understand it to begin with. So what Bayes' theorem is basically a mathematical formula which helps us to calculate probabilities. So in the case of the resurrection, for example, we want to know what is the probability that Jesus' resurrection happened given the evidence we have. And that's what this means. It means the probability of the resurrection R given the evidence E. And this is just the probability of the resurrection didn't happen, given E. And we want to kind of see how those balance. Now, at least in my speech, I probably won't go into huge detail on this, and so you don't need to be too scared off or anything. But I'm just going to explain how this works a little bit. So the idea is that our final calculation, the probability of the resurrection given the evidence, is going to be a balance between two factors. And the first of these factors is this middle. Actually, to make it simpler, the first of these factors is the one on the right-hand side. And this is just the ratio of the probability of the resurrection over the probability that the resurrection didn't happen. So what we want to do is, we want to find a probability for the resurrection before we look at any of the evidence. And then we want to multiply it by this factor. And that will give us a final probability, which is the probability of the resurrection given the evidence. And philosophers and logicians will typically talk of this as the prior probability of the resurrection, and this is the posterior probability of the resurrection. And that means that this is the probability prior to looking at the evidence, and this is the probability posterior, after looking at the evidence. And the way we assess this is we have, like I say, we have this ratio of prior probabilities, and we multiply them by this middle factor. And this is the probability of the evidence given the resurrection, divided by the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection didn't happen. Now, just to explain how that might work and how we go about doing this, and why it makes sense. If the resurrection explains the evidence, if, for example, the resurrection explains the empty tomb and things like that, which I'm going to be talking about in my speech, and Greg might say a little bit about it as well, then this top factor might be quite big. But if the resurrection didn't happen, at least Christians will say that the evidence is very surprising. It's very surprising that there would be an empty tomb, that the disciples would start Christianity and so on, if the resurrection didn't happen. I'm trying to make this neutral, so Greg might dispute that a little bit, but that's the idea behind it. The idea is that Christians will want to say, if they want to justify belief in the resurrection, that the probability of the evidence, if the resurrection didn't happen, is very low. If the resurrection didn't happen, it's very unlikely that we'd have this evidence. And so what that would mean is that this bottom factor is very low. So if we have a high number for this top factor and a low number for this bottom factor, then the whole factor will be quite a big number. And if we multiply quite a big number by the prior probability of the resurrection, we find that the posterior probability of the resurrection is a lot higher than it was before. And that's roughly how the evidence works. I hope I've explained it at least enough for you to kind of get the gist throughout mine and Greg's talks, but if Greg wants to add anything, I'll let him do so now.
Yeah, can I have it?
You can change to yours, yeah.
Okay. Give me a second. So to make it complicated for you, I'm going to use a different version of Bayes' theorem. But they're equivalent. This looks different. So here, forgetting about the resurrection, this is just general. Here's any hypothesis H. The probability of H given evidence E is equal to what Callum rightly called the prior probability of H times the, what I call the explanatory likelihood, the ability of H to explain the evidence E. You find this in the numerator, the denominator, but you also find the denominator the same thing for not H. You have to look at the opposite hypothesis. So where Callum was talking about R and not R, and by the way, he's using the turnstile. Just so we don't totally confuse you, I'm using the tilde, he's using the turnstile. They're two different symbols for the same thing, right? They're both equally valid. So this is more general, and you can substitute